Picture the world of the Middle Ages for a moment. What comes to mind? Perhaps you see a knight in gleaming, impossibly heavy armor, a fair maiden waiting in a stone tower, or a muddy village where everyone believed the earth was flat and rarely, if ever, bathed. These images are painted so vividly in our collective imagination, reinforced by countless stories and films. But what if nearly every single one of those pictures is a complete and total fabrication, a myth carefully constructed over centuries that has little to do with the vibrant, complex, and utterly surprising reality of medieval life? We've been sold a version of history that is often more fairy tale than fact, and today we are going to shatter those illusions one by one. Welcome to a journey back through time, not to the Middle Ages you think you know, but to the one that actually existed. This is for everyone who has ever wondered about the truth behind the legends, for the curious minds who suspect that history is far stranger and more wonderful than our simplified storybooks let on. We are about to dive deep into the evidence, sifting through the archives and listening to the real voices of the past, to tackle 25 of the most persistent and pervasive medieval myths head-on. From the shocking hygiene habits of ordinary people to the revolutionary scientific understanding they actually possessed, we are going to systematically debunk the falsehoods and reveal a world that was intellectually curious, surprisingly sophisticated, and teeming with a humanity that feels instantly recognizable to our own. So consider this your formal invitation to a grand historical investigation. Grab your virtual helmet and shield, because we are charging straight into the past, armed with facts and a healthy dose of skepticism. Prepare to have your perspective completely upended as we explore how the real Middle Ages were a time of incredible innovation, profound social change, and yes, even a good deal of cleanliness and reason. The truth is waiting, and it is far more fascinating than any fiction. Let's begin our myth-busting journey. Starting with myth number 1, we tackle a story so deeply embedded in our culture it feels like historical fact: the belief that medieval people thought the earth was flat. This idea paints a picture of a superstitious and ignorant populace, terrified of sailing off the edge of the world, but this could not be further from the truth. The reality is that among educated circles in Europe, the spherical nature of our planet was not just known, it was a fundamental, accepted principle of natural philosophy. This knowledge wasn't some hidden, controversial secret. It was taught in the great medieval universities from Oxford to Bologna as part of the standard curriculum known as the quadrivium. Thinkers and writers throughout the period consistently referred to the earth as a globe. Take the Venerable Bede, an English monk writing in the early 8th century. He didn't just hint at it, he stated it clearly, describing the earth as a round globe, and even using the phenomenon of different stars being visible in different latitudes as proof of its curvature. This wasn't an outlier opinion. Centuries later, the immensely influential writer Thomas Aquinas used the Earth's roundness as a standard example in his philosophical arguments. Even practical navigators understood the basic concept, as their methods for estimating latitude relied on principles that only made sense on a curved surface. So where did this pervasive flat Earth myth come from, if not from the Middle Ages themselves? Its origins are surprisingly modern, largely concocted in the 19th century. A key culprit was the American author Washington Irving, who wrote a highly fictionalized and dramatic biography of Christopher Columbus. In it, Irving created a gripping scene of Columbus battling against narrow-minded, flat Earth-believing clerics to secure funding for his voyage. It was a fantastic story of a visionary modern man fighting medieval ignorance, but it was almost entirely fabricated. The actual scholarly debate in Columbus's time wasn't about whether the earth was round. They all agreed on that. The dispute was over its size. Columbus was using a calculation that severely underestimated the Earth's circumference, while his opponents correctly believed the distance to Asia was far too great for his ships to manage. They were right, of course, and Columbus simply got lucky by stumbling upon a continent nobody knew was there. This flat Earth fiction was then eagerly adopted and amplified by later writers and historians, particularly those in the 1800s who wanted to portray the Middle Ages as a dark age of superstition, a backward period that the enlightened Renaissance and scientific revolution had to rescue humanity from. They created this false dichotomy to make their own era seem more brilliant by comparison. Manuscript illustrations from the time consistently show a spherical world, often held in the hand of God or Christ, and textbooks like Johannes de Sacrobosco's The Sphere, used for centuries in universities, laid out the proofs for a round Earth with elegant simplicity. The famous Flammarion engraving, which is often used to symbolize medieval flat Earth belief, actually dates from the 19th century, making it a perfect symbol not of medieval ignorance, but of our own modern misconceptions about the past. Moving from the intellectual world to the battlefield of ideals, we confront another deeply romanticized image, the chivalrous knight. We all know the archetype, the gallant warrior in shining armor, pledging his loyalty to a lady, defending the weak and fighting with unwavering honor. This noble figure is a cornerstone of our medieval fantasy, but the truth about the average knight is far less glamorous and infinitely more complex. The crucial detail we must understand is that chivalry was not a universal code of conduct. It was an aspirational ideal, a literary fantasy primarily crafted for and consumed by the aristocracy. In the quiet of a castle's great hall, listening to a poet sing of Lancelot or Gawain, a lord might dream of such perfection. But out on the muddy, blood-soaked fields of real medieval Europe, a very different kind of man often wore the knight's spurs. Many were, in essence, heavily armed landholders whose primary concerns were wealth, territorial control, and the brutal exercise of power. They were trained from youth for combat, and their social standing depended on their effectiveness in war, not on their courtesy. The historical record is brutally clear on this point. Consider the relentless chaos of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that stretched over a century. Here, chivalric ideals frequently crumbled in the face of military pragmatism and outright greed. Knights on both sides regularly engaged in the systematic pillaging of the French countryside, a tactic known as the chevauchée. These were not honorable clashes between noble opponents. They were calculated campaigns of terror designed to burn crops, destroy livelihoods, and cripple the enemy's economy by targeting the civilian population. Ordinary peasants whose labors funded the entire feudal system saw their homes torched and their families left to starve, all at the hands of men who supposedly lived by a code of honor. Beyond the battlefield, knights could be just as ruthless in their political dealings. Betrayal was commonplace. A knight might swear a sacred oath of fealty to his lord one day, only to abandon him for a richer rival the next if the price was right. Survival and advancement in a violent, uncertain world often demanded a ruthless pragmatism that the Romantic poems conveniently omitted. So why does the myth of the universally chivalrous knight persist with such strength? The answer lies in a potent combination of later literature and deliberate propaganda. Tales of King Arthur's court, which saw a massive resurgence in the High and Late Middle Ages, were not mere entertainment. They were a form of social engineering created to provide a behavioral model for the knightly class. This literature promoted the virtues of loyalty, courtly love, and martial prowess in the service of good, offering a template for how a powerful warrior should behave in an attempt to curb the worst of their violent excesses. It was a way for the church and the monarchy to try and tame a warrior aristocracy, to channel their aggression outward against infidels in the Crusades or inward to maintain a stable social order. In this light, chivalry was a tool, a beautiful piece of propaganda that served to whitewash the often savage reality of a knight's profession. The stark contrast is visually arresting when you look at the art of the period. Illuminated manuscripts like the Grandes Chroniques de France show the grim reality knights sacking towns, putting civilians to the sword, and battling in chaotic, muddy melees. Juxtaposed with these are the idealized paintings from later centuries, showing pristine, thoughtful knights in moments of quiet contemplation or graceful courtly dance. One image shows the profession as it often was, the other shows the ideal it desperately wanted to believe about itself. The true knight of the Middle Ages lived in the tense space between these two images, a man caught between the brutal demands of his world and the soaring, nearly impossible standards of a beautiful dream. Now, let's wash away one of the most stubborn and pungent myths of all, the belief that medieval people were universally filthy, caked in grime, and never bathed. This image of a permanently unwashed populace living ankle-deep in waste is a caricature that simply doesn't hold up to the historical record. While it's true they didn't have our modern plumbing and sanitation systems, medieval people absolutely valued cleanliness, and a surprising amount of effort was devoted to personal and public hygiene. Across Europe, public bathhouses were a standard feature of town life, serving as vibrant social hubs where people from all walks of life could go to wash, relax, and even socialize. These establishments, often called stews, were so common in cities like London and Paris that they were regulated by town councils with set prices to prevent overcharging. For those who could afford it, bathing was a regular ritual. Wealthy households had bathtubs, often portable wooden barrels that would be brought into bedrooms and filled with hot water by servants. Personal grooming was also taken seriously. It was considered basic good manners to wash your hands before and after meals, and manuals on etiquette and health from the period are filled with advice on maintaining a clean appearance. The material culture of cleanliness further shatters the myth. Soap making was a major and respected craft, with guilds that protected specific recipes. Castile soap, a famous high-quality product made from olive oil, was a major export from southern Europe. Beyond soap, people used a variety of herbal infusions and aromatic waters for washing their hair and bodies. Recipes for tooth cleaning powders, often made from crushed herbs, honey, and even burnt bread or sage, have been found in household manuals showing a clear concern for oral hygiene. The idea that everyone had rotten teeth is another exaggeration. While dental care was primitive, people still tried to care for their teeth and sweeten their breath. So, if the evidence for cleanliness is so strong, where did this powerful image of the great unwashed come from? The myth has two primary sources, both from later eras. First, in the 16th century, the spread of a new and terrifying disease, syphilis, led to the widespread closure of the communal bathhouses that had been so popular in the Middle Ages. Fear that the disease was spreading through public bathing water caused a genuine cultural shift away from frequent immersion. Second, and perhaps more influentially, Victorian-era social reformers in the 19th century had a vested interest in portraying the past as a dark, dirty, and benighted place. By exaggerating the filth of previous centuries, they could better highlight the progress and moral superiority of their own era, with its new public health initiatives and sanitation projects. They projected their own contemporary squalor, a result of rapid industrialization and urban overcrowding, back onto the Middle Ages. Manuscript illustrations from the time itself tell a different story, depicting people bathing in tubs, using elaborate wash basins, and grooming themselves. Archaeological finds of delicate ear scoops, nail cleaners, and combs made from bone and ivory complete the picture of a society that, while facing different challenges than our own, was certainly not content to live in its own dirt. That persistent image of the grim medieval meal, a lump of grey gruel, a hunk of tough bread, and maybe a gnawed on bone if you were lucky, is another historical fiction we need to set aside. While the daily fare for the poorest in society was certainly humble and relied heavily on grains, the culinary world of the medieval elite, and even of many prosperous town dwellers, was a vibrant tapestry of colors, textures, and an almost dizzying array of bold, complex flavors. This was not a world afraid of seasoning. In fact, it was obsessed with it. Cookbooks that have survived from the period are not simple lists of instructions. They are windows into a sophisticated culinary culture. Take the form of curry, compiled by the master cooks for King Richard II's court in the late 14th century. This collection reveals a kitchen that was both a laboratory and a theater of power, creating dishes designed to impress and delight. The recipes call for a stunning variety of spices that would be the envy of many modern kitchens, not just common pepper, but also expensive, exotic imports like cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, mace, and grains of paradise. These spices were more than just flavorings. They were potent symbols of wealth and global reach, as valuable as gold, and used to display a host's immense prestige. The artistry, however, went far beyond just adding spice. Medieval cooks had a deep understanding of balancing flavors, creating a complex profile that we might find surprising. They loved pairing sweet and savory in the same dish. Imagine a chicken or pork pottage sweetened with dried fruits like raisins, currants, and prunes, and then given a sharp, acidic kick with verjuice, the sour juice pressed from unripe grapes. This created a sweet and sour dynamic that was immensely popular. They used almond milk made by grinding almonds with water as a rich, creamy base for many dishes, especially on fast days when real dairy was forbidden. Herbs we still use today, parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme, were grown in kitchen gardens and used abundantly for their fresh, aromatic qualities. A wealthy household's feast would have been a multisensory spectacle. The food was often brightly colored, using saffron for a brilliant yellow, sandalwood for red, and a variety of greens from herbs. Presentation was key, with dishes crafted to look like mythical beasts, castles, or coats of arms, turning the dinner table into a stage for a family's status and creativity. Of course, it's crucial to acknowledge that this level of culinary extravagance was not for everyone. The diet of the peasant majority was, by necessity, more restricted and revolved around the staples they could produce themselves: dark breads made from rye or barley, thick pottages of beans and peas, onions, leeks, and cabbages from their garden plots. For them, meat was a rarity, often limited to preserved bacon or an occasional chicken. Yet, even here, the picture wasn't one of unrelenting monotony. Historical records and archaeological evidence show that their meals were often nutritionally sound, supplemented with wild greens, nuts, berries, and for those living near rivers or the coast, fish. The real myth is the idea that this peasant diet was inherently bland or that it defined the entire era's cuisine. The romanticization of this simple peasant life, much like the myth of universal filth, is largely a product of later centuries, particularly the Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries, which idealized rural poverty as a purer, more virtuous state. This perspective conveniently erased the sophisticated urban and aristocratic food culture that thrived for hundreds of years. The true collapse of this complex medieval cuisine came later, partly due to the Little Ice Age affecting agriculture and, perhaps more significantly, the colonization of the Americas. While this introduced new ingredients like potatoes and tomatoes, it also fundamentally shifted trade routes and tastes. The incredibly spiced, sweet and sour, and intricately presented dishes of the medieval court gradually fell out of fashion, replaced by new culinary styles that emphasized the natural flavor of individual ingredients. We lost the recipe, quite literally, for what medieval food was actually like, and in that void, the myth of the bland, monotonous past was born. And it's exactly this reliance on the land and its seasons that brings us to our next powerful misconception: the myth of the ignorant, uneducated peasant. We've all seen the caricature, a hunchbacked, mud-spattered figure with a vacant stare, toiling mindlessly in a field, possessing no thoughts beyond their immediate physical labor. This image of the peasant as a simpleton, a human ox, is not only deeply insulting but historically bankrupt. The reality is that the medieval peasant, far from being ignorant, was a master of a vast and intricate body of practical knowledge, a knowledge system so essential that the entire feudal structure would have collapsed without it. Formal literacy and book learning were indeed rare, but to equate that with a lack of intelligence or education is to completely misunderstand the world they lived in. Their survival and the survival of their entire community depended on a sophisticated, hard-won understanding of their environment. Consider the sheer breadth of expertise required to manage a medieval farmstead. This wasn't just about digging holes and dropping seeds. It involved a deep, generational understanding of crop rotation, knowing which fields to leave fallow and for how long to maintain soil fertility. It meant mastering animal husbandry, knowing how to breed livestock, diagnose and treat common ailments, and manage grazing patterns. Beyond farming, a typical village was a hive of specialized, non-agricultural skills. Many peasants were also part-time carpenters, able to construct and repair their homes, barns, and tools. Others had knowledge of basic metalworking to maintain their plowshares and equipment. Perhaps one of the most critical areas of knowledge was herbal medicine. Village, wise women, and other informal healers possessed an extensive, practical understanding of local plants, using them to treat everything from fevers and infections to wounds and childbirth complications. This wasn't superstition, it was applied botany, the result of centuries of observation and experimentation. The social and legal life of the peasant also shatters the myth of passive servitude. While serfdom did exist, binding some to the land and the will of their lord, a significant portion of the peasantry were actually legally free tenants. These individuals rented their land and owed specific, defined obligations, but they enjoyed personal freedom and could often buy, sell, and bequeath property. Furthermore, peasants were not shut out of governance. They actively participated in the manor court, the local judicial body that settled disputes over land, debts, and minor offenses. These courts were often run by a jury of peasants themselves, and the records show them arguing their cases, citing local customs, and asserting their rights with a clear understanding of the law as it applied to them. The entire village community operated as a collective, making decisions about shared resources like common fields, woodlands, and waterways, managing the harvest, and organizing the maintenance of roads and bridges. This required negotiation, planning, and a complex form of local democracy. Their lives were not an unbroken cycle of grim labor either. The medieval calendar was punctuated by numerous festivals and holidays, many tied to the church or the agricultural year. These were occasions for communal celebration, featuring feasting, music, dancing, and games. Archaeological finds from peasant sites include simple flutes, whistles, and fiddles, as well as gaming pieces for board games like Merrill's, a predecessor to Nine Men's Morris. Storytelling, songs, and oral poetry were vibrant traditions, passing down history, moral lessons, and sheer entertainment through generations. This rich cultural life points to a community with its own values, joys, and creative expressions. So why does the myth of the brutish, ignorant peasant persist with such tenacity? Its origins are deeply political. For the later medieval and early modern elite, portraying the peasantry as intellectually inferior was a convenient way to justify the vast social and economic inequalities of the feudal system. If they were seen as incapable of higher thought, then their subservient position could be framed as a natural, even benevolent order. This narrative was then powerfully amplified during the Enlightenment. Thinkers of that era, eager to champion reason and progress, deliberately painted the entire Middle Ages as a dark age of superstition and stagnation. In this new story, the peasant became the ultimate symbol of that benighted past, an unthinking relic to be contrasted with the enlightened, rational citizen of the modern world. It was a useful fiction for those who wanted to define their own age as one of unparalleled light, a fiction that, unfortunately, we are still working to correct today. Now, let's tackle a visual that has been seared into our collective memory by 1,000 Hollywood films, the image of a knight in full plate armor, so hopelessly weighed down by his own suit that he needs a small crane or a team of servants with a winch to heave him clumsily onto his horse. It's a wonderfully dramatic scene, perfect for emphasizing the sheer bulk of medieval warfare, but as with so many of these stories, it's a complete fabrication. The reality of a knight's mobility in his armor is one of the most impressive feats of medieval engineering and physical training, and the myth of his immobility does a huge disservice to the warriors of the age. A full suit of plate armor, the kind that reached its pinnacle in the late 14th and 15th centuries, was not a clumsy metal prison. It was a masterpiece of the blacksmith's art, custom fitted to its wearer's body with an almost scientific understanding of weight distribution. Think of it not as a single heavy shell, but as an exoskeleton composed of dozens of individually articulated plates, carefully designed to sit on the body's strongest points, the shoulders, hips, and thighs, allowing the weight to be carried efficiently rather than dragging the wearer down. The entire ensemble, helmet and all, typically weighed between 45 and 55 pounds. To put that in a modern context, that's significantly less than the full combat load carried by a contemporary infantry soldier, who might be lugging 70 to 100 pounds of body armor, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The key difference is in the distribution. Where a modern soldier's pack is a burden carried in a concentrated way, the knight's weight was spread evenly over his entire frame, making it far more manageable and allowing for a remarkable degree of freedom. This potential for movement was then unlocked by a lifetime of relentless, specialized training. A boy destined for knighthood would begin his martial education as a page, often around the age of 7, and then graduate to being a squire. Throughout this entire period, he would be constantly training in armor, starting with lighter pieces and gradually progressing to a full harness. His body would adapt, his strength and endurance would build, and the movements required for combat, swinging a sword, grappling, mounting a horse, would become as natural as breathing. This wasn't just about building muscle, it was about developing a specific kind of muscle memory that allowed for fluid motion even under the constraints of steel plate. The most compelling evidence for this comes from the period's own instructional manuals. Fior de Liberi, an Italian fencing master writing in the early 15th century, produced an illustrated combat manual that reads like a medieval special forces training guide. His drawings show knights in full plate armor performing astonishing feats. They are depicted executing complex wrestling throws, performing nimble sidesteps and lunges, climbing scaling ladders, and even doing handstands and cartwheels. These were not theoretical exercises. They were practical combat techniques for the brutal reality of close quarters fighting on a medieval battlefield, where being knocked down did not mean the fight was over. A knight had to be able to get back on his feet quickly and under his own power. So where did this enduring and visually compelling myth of the hoisted knight originate? The confusion likely stems from a later historical conflation between two very different types of armor, battlefield gear and specialized tournament armor. By the late Middle Ages, jousting had evolved from a general martial exercise into a highly ritualized and spectacular public sport. For these specific events, knights would sometimes don a form of armor known as a grand guard or stexjug, a massively reinforced and much heavier suit designed for a single specific purpose, to withstand the tremendous impact of a lance strike in a head-on charge. This jousting armor was significantly less mobile, often bolted directly to the saddle for maximum stability, and could indeed be so cumbersome that mounting a horse without assistance was a challenge. It is this highly specialized ceremonial equipment that probably gave rise to the stories and later the cinematic depictions of knights needing mechanical help. The filmmakers of the 20th century, seeing illustrations of these immense jousting suits or perhaps even the actual artifacts in museums, simply applied that image of immobility to knights in all contexts, creating a universal truth out of a very specific exception. The best way to truly shatter this myth is to watch modern historians and martial artists clad in meticulously crafted replicas of actual battlefield armor. They routinely demonstrate the ability to run, vault into the saddle, roll on the ground, and yes, even perform those cartwheels and gymnastic moves depicted in Fior's manual, proving beyond any doubt that a fully armored knight was one of the most agile and formidable forces on the pre-modern battlefield. Yet another powerful myth we must confront is the persistent idea of the medieval church as a monolithic, repressive force that actively suppressed science and learning, plunging Europe into an age of intellectual darkness. This narrative of a conflict between faith and reason is so ingrained in our modern consciousness that it feels like an obvious historical truth. But the real story of the relationship between the church and intellectual life in the Middle Ages is one of profound complexity, patronage, and, most surprisingly, of being the primary engine that drove scientific inquiry and preserved the very knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance. The popular image of a repressive institution burning books and silencing curious minds is largely a fiction concocted centuries later, primarily during the Enlightenment, when thinkers were eager to paint their own era as one of unparalleled reason and the past as a period of superstitious tyranny. To understand the medieval reality, we need to look at where learning actually happened. For centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the monastery was not just a place of prayer, it was the nearest thing Europe had to a university, a research library, and a publishing house all rolled into one. Within the scriptorium, the writing room of a monastery, one of the most crucial cultural projects in human history was undertaken day after day, year after year. Monks working by candlelight meticulously copied by hand not only religious texts like the Bible and works of theology, but also the foundational texts of classical science and philosophy. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy, along with Roman authors and early Christian thinkers, were preserved on parchment because of this unending, dedicated labor. Without these monastic libraries, the vast intellectual heritage of the ancient world would have been lost forever. But they didn't just preserve, they actively engaged. Monastic schools were the first centers of formal education, teaching the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This curriculum was the direct ancestor of the modern university system, and it was fundamentally built upon a synthesis of faith and reason. This intellectual curiosity blossomed fully with the rise of the universities themselves in the 12th and 13th centuries. Institutions like the University of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were not secular entities fighting against the church. They were born from cathedral schools and operated under official papal charters that granted them remarkable autonomy. The church was, in essence, their founder and primary patron. It was within this church-sponsored framework that some of the greatest scientific minds of the Middle Ages flourished. Take Robert Grosseteste, the Bishop of Lincoln in the 13th century. He was not a sidelined figure. He was a leading intellectual who wrote groundbreaking works on optics, light, and the scientific method itself. He proposed that the universe began with an explosion of light and energy, a concept that fascinatingly prefigures the modern Big Bang theory. He championed the use of experimentation and mathematics to understand the natural world, arguing that one should test theories against observable reality. Then there is the even more famous Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar known as Dr. Mirabilis, the wonderful teacher. Bacon passionately advocated for experimental science, insisting that knowledge must be verified through direct observation and meticulous testing. His own work spanned optics, astronomy, chemistry, and linguistics. He described the precise anatomy of the eye, the properties of lenses, and even dreamed of flying machines and ocean-going ships without oars. These were not men working in secret, hiding from a repressive hierarchy. They were celebrated members of their religious orders, writing their revolutionary ideas openly and often dedicating their works to popes and bishops. The pinnacle of this intellectual synthesis is perhaps Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar and one of the most influential theologians in history. In his monumental work, the Summa Theologica, Aquinas masterfully wove together the logic of Aristotle with Christian doctrine, creating a powerful framework that saw faith and reason as two complementary paths to understanding a universe created by a rational God. For Aquinas, studying the natural world through science was a way of understanding the mind of the Creator. It was an act of devotion, not defiance, of course. It would be dishonest to claim there were never any tensions. The most famous clash, the trial of Galileo Galilei, is often held up as the ultimate proof of the Church's opposition to science. But this event occurred in the 17th century, well after the Middle Ages had ended, during the heated religious controversies of the Counter-Reformation. It is an error to project this early modern conflict back onto the medieval period. Within the Middle Ages itself, debates certainly occurred, particularly when philosophical conclusions seemed to challenge specific points of theological doctrine. But the general pattern was one of debate and reconciliation, not outright suppression. The condemnations of 1277 at the University of Paris, for instance, which banned certain Aristotelian propositions, were not a simple case of faith quashing reason. They were a complex attempt by church authorities to navigate the challenging new ideas flooding into Europe and to define the boundaries where philosophy might overstep into theology. Even these condemnations did not stop the teaching of Aristotle. They simply refined the context, and within decades, scholars like Aquinas had successfully integrated Aristotelian thought into the heart of Christian learning. The visual legacy of this partnership is stunning. Magnificent medieval libraries like the one at the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, with their rows of carefully catalogued manuscripts, stand as monuments to this scholarly zeal. Elaborate astronomical instruments such as astrolabes and armillary spheres were crafted and used by monks to track the heavens, calculating the dates for Easter and mapping the cosmos as they understood it. Portraits of scholarly monks bent over their books in deep study capture the true spirit of the age, not one of fear and repression, but of a profound and enduring quest for knowledge, a quest that was nurtured, funded, and advanced within the very heart of the medieval church. This brings us to a myth that fundamentally reshapes how we picture the very structure of medieval society: the belief that everyone died extremely young, that turning 30 meant you were practically ancient, and that the world was a society of youths without the wisdom of elders. It's a pervasive idea, one that paints a bleak picture of fleeting, tragic lives. But this notion rests on a critical and very common statistical misunderstanding. The key is to separate life expectancy at birth from the actual lifespan of an individual who made it past the perilous early years. Yes, the average life expectancy from birth in medieval Europe was indeed low, often cited between 30 and 35 years. That number, however, is a mathematical average that is dramatically skewed by one heartbreaking reality: the shockingly high rate of infant and child mortality. Diseases that are mere inconveniences today, like measles or dysentery, were often fatal for the very young. Poor nutrition and a lack of understanding of germ theory created a world where perhaps a quarter or even a third of all children did not live to see their 5th birthday. When you calculate an average that includes a huge number of deaths at age 0 or 1, it naturally pulls the overall number down into the 30s, creating a deeply misleading impression for those who manage to survive. The crucial distinction is this: if you could navigate the dangers of childhood and adolescence, your chances of living a long life were remarkably good. Reaching your 50s, 60s, or even 70s was not a rare miracle but a relatively common achievement for the robust adult. Think of it this way: the low life expectancy at birth doesn't mean a person celebrating their 30th birthday was on their deathbed. Far from it. For the person who had already reached 20, their life expectancy was often another 20, 30, or even 40 years. The real danger zone was behind them. We see this pattern vividly in the historical records that have survived. Take the world of royalty and the nobility, where birth and death dates were meticulously recorded. Helena of Aquitaine, one of the most formidable women of the entire Middle Ages, was a queen of both France and England, went on crusade, and led a rebellion against her husband, all before living to the impressive age of about 82. King Edward I of England, the Hammer of the Scots, lived to be 68. His contemporary, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II, a man of immense learning and controversy, died at 56. But you don't need to look only to kings and queens. Last wills and testaments, manorial court rolls, and guild records from towns and cities are filled with men and women described as the elder, clearly indicating a position of respect earned through long life. A master craftsman would typically not even achieve the highest rank in his guild until his 40s or 50s, after decades of training and work. These institutions were run by elders, not by youth. The visual evidence from the period itself powerfully contradicts the myth of a society without old age. Look at the magnificent tomb effigies found in cathedrals across Europe. While some commemorate those cut down in their prime, a great many show men and women in the clear fullness of their years. They are depicted with lined faces, their hands folded in prayer, their features showing the dignified weight of a long life lived. These are not the smooth, youthful faces of 30-year-olds. They are portraits of people in their 60s and 70s. Medieval art and literature also frequently reference the different stages of life, with clear respect afforded to the elderly for their accumulated wisdom and experience. In a world that relied heavily on oral tradition and practiced crafts passed down through generations, the elder was a vital repository of knowledge, the person who remembered the great frost of 50 winters past, the best method for smelting a particular metal, or the complex legal customs of the manor. The idea of a society devoid of grandparents is a modern fiction. Medieval families absolutely knew and relied upon their elders. So how did this myth of universal youthful death become so entrenched? It largely stems from a later, superficial reading of those stark life expectancy statistics. When historians of the 18th and 19th centuries first began to analyze demographic data, the dramatic difference between pre-modern and modern averages was startling. The narrative of a short, brutish life fit perfectly with the emerging Enlightenment and Victorian view of the past as a more primitive, harsher time. It was a simple, powerful soundbite that seemed to encapsulate the struggle of existence before modern medicine. The reality, as we've seen, was far more nuanced. People did not age faster. A 35-year-old was not frail and decrepit. They aged at the same biological rate we do today. They simply lived in a world with far greater risks, especially in childhood. This corrected understanding forces us to reimagine the medieval village or town. It was not a place teeming only with young parents and their swarms of children. It was a multi-generational community where the wisdom of a 60-year-old blacksmith was valued, where a 70-year-old nun might run a convent's infirmary with decades of herbal knowledge, and where the stories told by the fireside spanned living memory across 80 years. Recognizing this longevity restores a crucial layer of social depth and continuity to the Middle Ages, revealing a world where life, for those who survived its initial trials, could be just as long, rich, and full of experience as it is today. And just as the myth of universal early death crumbles under scrutiny, so too does another deeply ingrained belief about daily medieval life, the idea that everyone, from the smallest child to the oldest grandmother, drank nothing but beer or wine because their water was so hopelessly contaminated. This is a story we've all heard. That water was a deadly poison, and the only safe sanitary alternative was alcoholic beverages. While it's absolutely true that medieval people consumed staggering quantities of ale, beer, and wine, the notion that they never drank plain water is a dramatic oversimplification that misses the complex practical realities of their world. The truth is, clean, fresh water was not only consumed but actively sought out, valued, and understood to be essential for life. Think about the landscape of a medieval village or town. Its very location was often determined by the presence of a reliable, clean water source. A fresh water spring, a clean running stream, or a deeply dug well was the absolute heart of a community. Archaeologists find the remains of these wells constantly, lined with stone or brick to keep the water pure. In towns, the profession of the water carrier was a common and vital one. These individuals would haul fresh water from public conduits or clean rivers directly to the doors of wealthier households, selling it by the bucket. Monasteries, those hubs of sophisticated engineering, often had incredibly complex plumbing systems called conduits, using lead or wooden pipes to bring fresh spring water from miles away for drinking, cooking, and washing. There was also a clear, practical understanding of water quality. Medieval medical and household texts frequently warn against drinking stagnant or muddy water, advising people to draw from fast-flowing streams or deep wells. They might not have known about microscopic bacteria, but they understood through direct observation that bad water made you sick, and they took active steps to avoid it. So why, then, was alcohol such an overwhelming staple of the medieval diet? The answer lies not in water being universally undrinkable, but in the brilliant practicality of brewing and the nutritional benefits of the final product. For the vast majority of people, the most common daily drink was not a strong, intoxicating ale, but something called small beer or table beer. This was a brew with a very low alcohol content, typically around 1 to 2%, sometimes even less. It was made from a second or third mashing of the same grains used to make stronger ale, meaning it was a thrifty, efficient use of resources. The magic of small beer wasn't its alcohol, it was the brewing process itself. To make beer, you have to boil the water. In an age without modern sanitation, this boiling killed off harmful pathogens, making small beer a consistently safer and more stable beverage than water that might have been stored in a questionable barrel or drawn from a contaminated urban source. Furthermore, this mild brew was actually nutritious. It contained B vitamins and trace minerals from the grains, providing a valuable caloric supplement to a diet that could be heavy on bread and pottage. For laborers doing hard physical work, it was a source of hydration, nutrition, and a few calories all in one. Children drank it, nursing mothers drank it, and it was consumed throughout the day in the same way we might sip on water, juice, or tea. Of course, stronger alcoholic drinks were also immensely popular, but again, for reasons that go far beyond just safety. Wine, particularly in southern Europe, and stronger ales in the north, were loved for their taste and their psychological effects. They were a welcome comfort in a difficult world and a central part of social and religious life. A tavern was a hub of community, and sharing a jug of ale was a sign of fellowship. These beverages also provided concentrated calories, which were crucial for surviving cold winters and periods of hard labor. The importance of brewing was so profound that it was often a domestic task managed by women, known as brewsters or alewives, who would supply their household and sell the surplus. The myth that no one drank water likely stems from this undeniable, visible importance of brewing in the daily rhythm of life. Chroniclers and writers of the time didn't bother to meticulously document every cup of water consumed. They wrote about the ale and wine that were purchased, taxed, and celebrated. Later historians, looking back and seeing the sheer volume of alcohol production, combined with known later problems with urban water supplies during the Industrial Revolution, simply connected the dots incorrectly, creating a blanket statement that erased the everyday reality of the freshwater well, the clean spring, and the simple, life-giving cup of water that was, without a doubt, a daily. Part of medieval life for millions, of course, the idea of the Middle Ages as a non-stop carnival of cruelty is one of the most vivid and horrifying images we've inherited. We picture public squares perpetually filled with the sounds of cracking bones and the sight of grotesque implements of pain, a world where justice was synonymous with sadistic spectacle. But while the medieval period certainly had a different, and by our standards harsher concept of justice, the reality was far more nuanced, regulated, and surprisingly bureaucratic. Judicial torture was indeed a legal tool, but it wasn't the first or even the most common resort. Its use was actually constrained by a web of rules that might seem shocking given the popular myth. In many legal systems, particularly those influenced by Roman law, which saw a revival from the 12th century onwards, torture could not be used arbitrarily. There was a crucial legal principle at play. You needed what was called half-proof before torture was even an option. This wasn't a vague suspicion or a neighbor's gossip. Half-proof meant substantial, compelling evidence against a suspect that still fell short of the full proof required for a conviction. This could be something like 2 credible eyewitnesses to a crime, but with one witness being of a lower social status, or strong circumstantial evidence that pointed overwhelmingly to one individual. The court had to be persuaded that a crime had likely occurred and that this specific person was probably responsible before they could legally authorize the application of pain to extract a confession, which would then complete the proof. Furthermore, the process was often anything but a free-for-all. The law frequently specified the types of torture that could be used, with methods like the strappado, where the victim's hands were tied behind their back and they were hoisted into the air, dislocating their shoulders being common, while more inventive and mutilating devices were far rarer in actual court records than in our imaginations. There were even rules about intensity and duration. A confession obtained under torture was not considered valid until the accused calmly reaffirmed it at least a full day later, away from the dungeon and the immediate fear of pain. If they recanted, the torture might be repeated, but the entire procedure was logged by a scribe, creating a paper trail that modern historians can still examine today. This legalistic framework shows that for all its brutality, judicial torture was seen as a method to uncover truth, not a form of casual, random brutality. It was a grim part of the system, but a part that operated, in theory at least, within defined boundaries. For the vast majority of people who found themselves on the wrong side of the law, their experience was far less dramatic, though still deeply unpleasant. The backbone of medieval justice was not the rack or the Iron Maiden, but the financial penalty and public shaming. Manorial court rolls, which recorded the petty crimes of village life, are filled with entries detailing fines for everything from letting your pigs stray into the Lord's orchard to brewing substandard ale. These fines were a crucial source of income for the manor and a way to settle disputes without resorting to violence or imprisonment. Then there was the realm of public humiliation. The stocks and the pillory were the quintessential punishments for a wide range of minor offenses like fraud, petty theft, or being a habitual public nuisance. Being locked into these wooden frames in the village square for a few hours or days was a psychological punishment more than a physical one. It exposed the offender to the ridicule and sometimes the rotten food of their own community, damaging their reputation and social standing in a way that a simple fine could not. This was justice as social correction, a powerful reminder that the community's opinion mattered. Banishment was another common, and for the individual, devastating punishment. To be expelled from your town or village, cut off from your family, your livelihood, and the protection of the law, was often a de facto death sentence, forcing you into the dangerous life of an outlaw. These were the everyday mechanics of maintaining order. When we do encounter the truly horrific punishments, the drawing and quartering for treason, the burning of heretics, the breaking on the wheel for notorious murderers, it's vital to understand their context. These were not everyday events. They were reserved for crimes considered the ultimate threats to the social and political order, high treason against the crown, or the most severe forms of heresy that challenged the foundation of spiritual authority. Their purpose was explicitly theatrical. A public execution of this magnitude was a piece of political propaganda, a brutal civic drama designed to demonstrate the overwhelming power of the king or the church and to deter anyone who might contemplate similar crimes. The drawn-out, ritualized nature of the suffering was the entire point. It was meant to be so terrifying, so unforgettable, that the memory would sear itself into the consciousness of every witness. The body of the traitor, hacked into pieces and sent to different cities, was a grisly message posted across the kingdom. Yet even in these extreme cases, there was often a strange undercurrent of ritual and even mercy. It was not uncommon for the executioner to be secretly paid to ensure the condemned was dead before the most mutilating parts of the sentence were carried out, or for a king to grant a last-minute pardon, transforming the spectacle from one of brutal vengeance into one of majestic, godlike mercy. So how did our modern imagination become so saturated with the image of the dungeon as a standard feature of every castle, filled with an arsenal of creative agony? The answer lies not in the Middle Ages but centuries later. The Gothic horror novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, craving a dark and romanticized past, invented and popularized many of the devices we now associate with medieval torture. The infamous Iron Maiden, for instance, a spiked coffin-like contraption, appears to have no historical basis before the early 19th century. Similarly, the sensationalist writers and collectors of the Victorian era, fascinated by the macabre and eager to contrast their own enlightened age with a supposedly more barbaric one, assembled collections of medieval torture devices, often mislabeling agricultural tools or fabricating items whole cloth to fill their morbid museums. They projected their own anxieties and fascinations onto the past, creating a distorted funhouse mirror version of medieval justice that was far more focused on inventive cruelty than on the tedious, but far more common, reality of fines, shaming, and banishment. The true medieval dungeon was often just a damp, dark cellar used for temporary detention before a trial, not a permanent home for endless suffering. By focusing only on the most extreme and rarest examples, we miss the complex and in many ways more familiar legal world that the vast majority of medieval people actually inhabited. Perhaps the most potent symbol of the entire medieval era is the castle, but the image we hold is a profound deception. We see those skeletal ruins today, empty stone shells scoured by centuries of wind and rain, their interiors reduced to echoing chambers of bare rock and dust. It's easy to project our own feelings of gloom onto these spaces, imagining them as perpetually dark, damp, and miserable prisons for their inhabitants. This, however, is the ultimate historical illusion, a classic case of judging a building by its corpse. In their vibrant prime, castles were not grim fortresses of despair. They were bustling, colorful, and surprisingly comfortable centers of administration, power, and domestic life. The ruins we explore have been stripped naked by time, but when we clothe them in their original splendor, a completely different world emerges. The first thing to shatter is the myth of the dark and colorless interior. The Great Hall, the social and political heart of any castle, was anything but a gray, barren space. Its walls were alive with color. Expensive and elaborate wall paintings covered the stone, depicting scenes from history, mythology, or religious stories in brilliant shades of red, blue, and green, created from pigments like vermilion, azurite, and verdigris. These weren't merely for decoration, they were a powerful display of the lord's wealth, education, and cultural sophistication. Alongside the paintings, the walls would have been hung with immense woven tapestries. These magnificent textiles served a dual purpose. They were stunning works of art that told complex narratives, and they acted as crucial insulation, trapping heat inside the stone rooms and blocking drafts from seeping through the walls. Banners bearing the Lord's heraldic coat of arms added to the visual spectacle, a constant reminder of his lineage and authority. The hall would have been filled with the warm, flickering light of numerous candles and oil lamps, their flames reflecting off polished metal plates, glazed pottery, and the vibrant colors everywhere, creating an atmosphere that was far from gloomy. Even the windows, which we often think of as tiny, light-starved slits, were more sophisticated than we assume. While their primary design was for defense, making them narrow on the outside to protect against missiles, they were often splayed widely on the inside to maximize the amount of light entering the room. They were rarely left as open holes. Wooden shutters, often lined with fabric or wool, could be closed tightly at night or in bad weather to keep out the cold and rain. During the day, these shutters were opened, and the window apertures were frequently fitted with panes of oiled cloth or scraped animal parchment. This material, while not transparent like modern glass, would allow a soft, diffused golden light to flood the interior, illuminating the space in a warm, gentle glow. In wealthier households, actual glass was a prized possession. Although prohibitively expensive and usually reserved for churches and the very richest nobles, small, diamond-shaped panes of glass, known as quarries, were sometimes set in lead frames and fitted into the windows of the Lord's most private chambers, a clear sign of almost unimaginable luxury. Comfort was a paramount concern, especially in the Lord's private family quarters, a room known as the solar, located typically off the Great Hall and often on an upper floor for more light and privacy. The solar was the medieval equivalent of a cozy family living room. Here, the stone floors were covered with thick, woven carpets or fragrant rushes mixed with herbs like lavender and mint to provide a soft, sweet-smelling surface. Walls were hung with embroidered curtains or yet more tapestries, creating a sense of intimacy and warmth. Furniture, while not abundant by our standards, was of high quality. Carved wooden chests for storing clothes and valuables, comfortable chairs with cushions, and a large curtained bed piled high with furs and linen sheets. This was a space for relaxation, private conversation, and family life, a world away from the cold, militaristic image we so often hold. This is not to say that castle life was perfectly comfortable by our modern standards. The Great Hall could be drafty, and the central hearth, while a cheery focal point, would have filled the upper parts of the room with smoke, requiring vents in the roof. The lower levels, used for storage and servants' quarters, were certainly darker and more basic, but the overarching reality is one of a dynamic, multi-functional community. A castle's courtyard was not a desolate, windswept space. It was a vibrant, noisy, and smelly hub of activity, a combination of a military barracks, a government office, a workshop, and a farm. Soldiers trained, blacksmiths hammered at forges, cooks and servants hurried about their duties, children and dogs played underfoot, and travelers and merchants came and went. The castle was a living, breathing organism, the bustling center of its local world. The myth of the universally dark and miserable castle is a direct result of us seeing these structures only in their final, decayed state. They have been stripped by centuries of ruin, their wooden floors, colorful plaster, fine furniture, and bustling inhabitants all gone. To see the truth, we must look at the digital reconstructions created by historians and archaeologists, or the meticulous artists' impressions that use archaeological evidence to rebuild these spaces virtually. They show us halls glowing with painted color, chambers furnished with rich textiles, and courtyards teeming with life. They restore the castle not as a skeleton, but as a vibrant heart, beating with the color, comfort, and complex humanity of the true Middle Ages. Now, let's untangle a profound and common chronological mix-up that completely reshapes our understanding of medieval power: the myth that kings ruled by an unquestionable divine right. We often picture a medieval monarch as an absolute autocrat, answerable only to God, his word carrying the weight of divine command. This idea, however, is largely a phantom when we look at the true political landscape of the Middle Ages. The robust theory of the divine right of kings, where a ruler's authority comes directly from God and is therefore beyond any earthly challenge, including from the Church, is actually a product of the early modern period. It was most famously championed in the 17th century by rulers like King James I of England, who were attempting to consolidate state power against the rising forces of Parliament and religious dissent. To project this later doctrine back onto the medieval world is to miss the vibrant, contentious, and very real power struggles that defined the era. The reality of medieval politics was not one of absolute, God-given autocracy, but a constant, messy, and often brutal negotiation between competing centers of power: the crown, the papacy, and the nobility. This created a delicate and frequently unstable system of checks and balances. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of this limitation on royal power is the Magna Carta, sealed by the notoriously unpopular King John of England in 1215. This document was not the result of divine affirmation. It was forced upon a weakened king by his powerful and rebellious barons. The Magna Carta is remarkable precisely because it explicitly stated that the king was not above the law. It laid out specific feudal rights, protected the church from royal interference, and established that no free man could be imprisoned or punished without the lawful judgment of his peers. This was the very antithesis of divine right absolutism. It was a practical, hard-won contract that acknowledged the king had obligations to his subjects and that his power had legal boundaries. Simultaneously, the idea that a medieval pope would meekly submit to a king's divine authority is utterly foreign to the historical record. The relationship between regnum royal power and sacerdotium priestly power was a centuries-long tug of war, with the rope being pulled violently in both directions. One of the most dramatic clashes occurred in the late 11th century between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. Gregory, in a radical assertion of papal supremacy, declared that the Pope had the authority to depose emperors and that the spiritual power of the Church was categorically superior to the temporal power of kings. When Henry resisted, Gregory excommunicated him, formally cutting him off from the Church and effectively absolving all of his subjects of their oaths of allegiance. This was a political nuclear option. The excommunication crippled Henry's authority, leading his nobles to revolt. The desperate emperor was forced into a breathtaking act of public submission. In the depths of winter in 1077, Henry traveled to the castle of Canossa in Italy, where the Pope was staying. For 3 days, the emperor stood barefoot in the snow outside the gates, dressed in the rough wool of a penitent, begging the Pope for forgiveness and absolution. The scene at Canossa was not a king acting with divine right. It was a king brought to his knees by the spiritual authority of the Church, a powerful testament to the fact that royal power was anything but absolute. This constant tension was also reflected in the dominant political theory of the time, known as the Two Swords Doctrine. This theory held that God had given two swords to humanity for its governance: the spiritual sword wielded by the Pope and the Church, and the temporal sword wielded by the emperor and kings. The key point was that both swords were seen as deriving their legitimacy from God, but they were meant to be wielded in harmony with the spiritual sword guiding the temporal. This created a framework for perpetual negotiation and often conflict between the two powers. Philosophers and theologians like John of Salisbury even went so far as to justify tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrannical ruler, if that ruler broke his sacred contract with his people and governed unjustly. This was a world away from the 17th century doctrine that made rebellion against a king a sin against God himself. the myth of a medieval divine right of kings likely gained traction because later rulers found it a useful fiction. In the 17th century, as nations were centralizing and monarchs were trying to break free from the lingering influence of the Catholic Church and the political power of their own nobility, they reached for an ideological tool that would cement their authority as supreme and unchallengeable. They looked back and selectively reinterpreted the past, promoting the idea that kings had always ruled by a direct, unmediated mandate from heaven. This narrative was then amplified by historians who saw the rise of the modern nation-state as the inevitable endpoint of political development, and thus portrayed the messy, shared sovereignty of the Middle Ages as a primitive stage on the road to absolute monarchy. The truth, however, is far more interesting. The medieval political world was a complex ecosystem of competing rights, obligations, and powers, where a king's authority was constantly tested, negotiated, and, as the Magna Carta and the humiliation at Canossa so vividly show, could be decisively limited by the collective will of his barons or the spiritual censure of the Pope. And so we arrive at perhaps the single most iconic and yet completely fabricated image from the entire medieval world. The Viking warrior, axe in hand, screaming from the deck of a longship, crowned with a magnificent pair of horns or wings. It's a picture so deeply embedded in our culture that it feels like historical fact, appearing on everything from sports team logos to heavy metal album covers. But the truth is as stark as a Scandinavian winter. There is absolutely zero archaeological evidence that Vikings ever wore horned or winged helmets into battle. Not a single fragment from a burial site, not one piece from a hoard, not a solitary artifact from the entire Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th to the early 11th century, supports this idea. In fact, every genuine Viking helmet ever discovered points in the exact opposite direction, toward a brutal, pragmatic functionality. Let's think about this from a warrior's perspective for a moment. Imagine you are in the thick of a shield wall, a chaotic press of bodies where survival depends on speed, leverage, and not giving your enemy a single advantage. Now picture wearing a helmet with two large, protruding handles on either side. In that life or death struggle, a horned helmet would be less a piece of armor and more of a suicide device. An opponent wouldn't even need to strike you. They could simply grab a horn, yank your head to the side, and expose your neck for a killing blow. It would be unbalanced, cumbersome, and would catch on rigging while boarding a ship. The actual helmets that have been found, like the incredibly rare and nearly complete example from German Bu in Norway, are masterpieces of practical design. The German Bu helmet is a simple, rounded iron cap with a protective guard around the eyes and nose, known as a spectacled guard. Its shape is smooth, deflecting blows rather than catching them. It's designed for one purpose only, to keep its wearer alive in the brutal reality of close-quarters combat. So, where on earth did this pervasive myth come from if not from the Vikings themselves? The trail leads us not to a Scandinavian burial mound, but to the flamboyant stages and canvases of 19th century Europe. This was the age of Romanticism, a cultural movement that looked back at the past with a sense of drama, nationalism, and awe. Artists and writers were eager to find heroic, archetypal figures from history, and the Vikings, with their sagas of exploration and conquest, were perfect candidates. The single most influential force in cementing the horned helmet in the popular imagination was undoubtedly Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, first performed in its entirety in 1876. Wagner's costume designer Carl Emil Doppler, working from a mix of misunderstood ancient sources and pure theatrical instinct, created striking costumes for the characters, adorning them with winged and horned helmets. The goal was spectacle, not historical accuracy. On the stage, under the gaslights, these helmets looked powerful, primal, and fearsome, perfectly matching the opera's monumental music and themes. They were a visual shortcut to signify a barbaric, heroic age. At the same time, Romantic painters across Scandinavia and Germany began depicting their Viking ancestors in the same way, creating a feedback loop of imagery that was so compelling and dramatic it simply overwrote the historical record in the public's mind. There is, however, a fascinating historical footnote that often fuels the confusion. Ceremonial helmets with horns have been found in Scandinavia, but they date from the Nordic Bronze Age, a period that ended over 1,000 years before the first Viking longship ever set sail. The most famous examples are the magnificent Vixo helmets discovered in Denmark in the 1940s. These are stunning artifacts made of bronze and decorated with curling horns and eyes, but they are believed to have been used in religious rituals, perhaps by sun-worshipping priests around the year 900 CE. They were never meant for battle. It's possible that 19th century artists uncovering descriptions or even drawings of such ancient artifacts mistakenly attributed them to their more famous Viking successors, blending two vastly different eras into one iconic but entirely incorrect image. The visual contrast is the most powerful way to set the record straight. On one side, you have the fanciful 19th century paintings, muscular, shirtless Norsemen in elaborate winged helmets looking like mythical gods. On the other, you have the real archaeology, the simple, sturdy, and deeply practical German Bu helmet, a piece of equipment worn by a professional warrior who understood that in a fight, the only thing you want sticking out from your head is your own fierce determination. Of course, the practice of bloodletting brings us to our next great misconception, the idea that medieval medicine was little more than a chaotic swamp of superstition, where irrational beliefs and the indiscriminate use of leeches trumped any real medical knowledge. This image of the medieval barber surgeon as a sort of superstitious butcher is a powerful one, but it completely misrepresents a world that, while operating without our modern understanding of germs, was built upon a logical, systematic, and surprisingly sophisticated framework for understanding the human body. The cornerstone of this system was the theory of the four humors, a concept inherited from the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates and Galen. This wasn't mere guesswork, it was a comprehensive model that viewed health as a delicate balance between four vital fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked to specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, and dry, and to seasons, elements, and even personality types. An excess of one humor, the theory held, would lead to illness. A fever, for instance, with its heat and inflammation, was seen as an overabundance of blood, a hot and wet humor. A head cold with its production of phlegm was an excess of that cold and wet substance. From this foundational theory flowed a wide range of logical, if ultimately flawed, treatments designed to restore the body's balance. Bloodletting or phlebotomy was the most famous of these. It wasn't a random act of brutality, it was a calculated procedure prescribed for conditions believed to be caused by an excess of blood. The practice was highly regulated. Medical texts gave precise instructions on which vein to open for which ailment, how much blood to take, and even the best times of day or year to perform the procedure, all based on the humoral associations. The use of leeches was simply one method of achieving this, prized for their ability to draw blood from specific, hard-to-reach areas. But medicine was about so much more than just letting blood. Herbal remedies were the first line of defense for most people, and here the medieval world displayed a profound and practical knowledge of botany. Monasteries were the primary centers of medical care and learning for centuries, and within their walls they maintained intricate gardens known as physic gardens. These were not just decorative plots, they were living pharmacies meticulously cultivated with hundreds of plants whose medicinal properties were well documented. A monk infirmarian would grow sage for sore throats, lavender for headaches, mint for digestion, and comfrey, known as knitbone, to poultice wounds and set fractures. The sophistication of this herbal knowledge is stunningly preserved in beautifully illustrated manuscripts known as herbals. These books are far more than simple lists. They are detailed encyclopedias describing each plant's appearance, habitat, and specific medicinal uses, often with remarkably accurate drawings to aid in identification. They represent generations of accumulated practical experience, a vast corpus of knowledge about how the natural world could be used to alleviate human suffering. Beyond herbs, dietary advice was a critical part of treatment, all filtered through the humoral lens. Physicians would prescribe specific foods to counter an imbalance. For a patient with a cold, wet condition like a phlegmatic cough, they might recommend hot, dry foods like pepper and garlic. For someone with a hot, feverish ailment, they would suggest cool, moist foods like cucumbers and melons. This holistic approach, seeking to treat the whole body through diet, regimen, and medicine, is a concept that feels surprisingly modern in its intent. And then there was surgery, an area where medieval practitioners demonstrated remarkable skill and innovation, often in the face of unimaginable pain and risk of infection. While the lack of anesthesia and antiseptic conditions meant survival was never guaranteed, surgeons performed incredibly complex operations that required a steady hand and deep anatomical knowledge. They developed techniques for repairing hernias, removing bladder stones, and even a primitive form of cataract surgery where a sharp needle was used to displace the clouded lens and restore a degree of vision. Texts on surgery, like the work of the great 13th century Italian surgeon Lanfranc of Milan or the Frenchman Guy de Chauliac, provide detailed, step-by-step instructions for procedures ranging from setting compound fractures to trepanation, drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure from a head injury. Archaeological evidence from skeletal remains confirms that people frequently survived these harrowing operations, with bone showing clear signs of healing around the surgical site. Perhaps one of the most telling examples of advanced medical thought comes from the field of women's health. A collection of texts known as the Trotula, originating from the medical school of Salerno in Italy in the 12th century, demonstrates a level of gynecological and obstetric knowledge that would not be surpassed for centuries. These texts, believed to have been authored or compiled by a female practitioner, discuss topics from fertility and menstruation to childbirth and cesarean sections performed on dying mothers in a final attempt to save the infant. They include recipes for herbal remedies to regulate menstruation, ointments for vaginal health, and even practical advice on choosing a wet nurse. The existence and widespread circulation of such a text completely shatters the stereotype of a uniformly patriarchal and ignorant medical establishment when it came to women's bodies. The myth of medieval medicine as pure superstition is, like so many others, a product of later centuries looking back and judging the past by their own new standards. When the humoral theory was finally overturned by the scientific discoveries of the Renaissance and beyond, everything that had been built upon it was dismissed as worthless. We threw out the sophisticated baby with the humoral bathwater, forgetting that within its own logical framework, medieval medicine was a complex, evolving, and deeply practical science, a testament to the enduring human drive to understand, to heal, and to relieve suffering, no matter the era. This brings us to one of the most foundational and misleading labels for the entire period, the very notion of the Dark Ages. For centuries, this term has been used to describe the era following the fall of Rome, evoking images of a civilization plunged into an abyss of ignorance, violence, and cultural emptiness, a 1,000-year-long pause in human progress. It is a powerful and dismal story, but it is a story that modern historians have now overwhelmingly rejected as a gross distortion of the truth. The reality is that the centuries from around 500 to 1000 AD were not a time of stagnation. They were an era of profound, if turbulent, transformation, a crucible in which the foundations of modern Europe were forged through innovation, adaptation, and remarkable artistic achievement. Let's start with the term itself. Who would want to call their own time dark? The people living through these centuries certainly did not. This label was a piece of brilliant, if cynical, propaganda invented centuries later during the Renaissance. Thinkers like the Italian poet Petrarch, looking back at the glories of Rome and Greece, saw the 1,000 years between their own time and that classical golden age as a middle period, a mediocre gap. They framed it as a long, dark night of barbarism and superstition that their own enlightened age was finally emerging from. This narrative was incredibly useful. It allowed Renaissance humanists to position themselves as the heroic restorers of light and learning, making their own achievements seem even more monumental by contrast. They created a powerful but completely false dichotomy between their light and the previous darkness, a dichotomy that has stubbornly persisted in our popular imagination. But what was actually happening during this so-called darkness? Far from being an empty void, this was a period of dynamic political rebirth. With the centralized bureaucracy of the Roman Empire gone, new kingdoms and identities were coalescing across Western Europe. The map was not a blank slate of chaos. It was a vibrant, shifting tapestry of rising powers. In Gaul, the Frankish kingdom under the Merovingian dynasty, and later the Carolingians, was laying the groundwork for what would become France and Germany. In England, the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy saw the formation of several powerful kingdoms, like Northumbria and Wessex, which would eventually unite. The Visigoths in Spain and the Lombards in Italy were establishing their own sophisticated legal codes and political structures. This was not a collapse into anarchy. It was the difficult, messy, and creative process of building new societies from the ground up, a process that required immense political and administrative skill. Perhaps the most tangible proof that this was not an age of stagnation lies in the field of technology, specifically agricultural technology. Two simple but revolutionary inventions, the heavy plow and the horse collar, utterly transformed the European landscape and economy. The thin, scratch plows of the Roman era were ill-suited to the rich, heavy, wet soils of northern Europe. But the new heavy plow, with its moldboard, could cut deep into this fertile earth, turn the soil over, and create the drainage ditches necessary for high-yield farming. This single tool opened up vast new tracts of land for cultivation, leading to a population boom. Coupled with this was the horse collar. The old yoke harnesses used by the Romans were designed for oxen and would choke a horse, preventing it from using its full strength. The new padded horse collar transferred the weight to the horse's shoulders and chest, allowing it to pull the heavy plow with far greater speed and efficiency than oxen. Horses could work more hours per day, increasing food production exponentially. This was not a dark age of technological regression. It was a period of profound innovation that literally fed the growth of medieval civilization. And then there is the art. If this was truly a time of cultural emptiness, how do we explain the breathtaking masterpieces that have survived? The term Dark Ages becomes utterly meaningless when you stand before the radiant complexity of the Book of Kells, an insular art masterpiece created around the year 800. Its pages are a riot of intricate, almost psychedelic patterns, woven with vibrant colors and gold leaf, a testament to the incredible skill and spiritual devotion of monks in remote Irish and Scottish monasteries. This was not a flickering candle in the dark, it was a blazing beacon of artistic genius. On the European continent, the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne consciously sought to revive the art and learning of the Roman world. In his court scriptorium, scribes developed a new, clear style of handwriting known as Carolingian minuscule, which became the basis for our modern lowercase alphabet. They produced breathtakingly illuminated manuscripts like the Utrecht Psalter, with its energetic, sketch-like illustrations that feel startlingly alive. These were not the products of a stagnant culture. They were the works of a society actively engaging with its past and creating a vibrant new artistic identity. The intellectual life of the era further shatters the myth. While the great urban schools of the Roman world had faded, the flame of learning was kept alive and carefully tended within the walls of monasteries. These were not merely hideouts for men fleeing the world, they were the data centers of their day. Monks dedicated their lives to the laborious, sacred task of copying manuscripts. They preserved not only the Bible and theological works, but also the foundational texts of classical science, philosophy, and literature by authors like Virgil, Plato, and Aristotle. This was not a passive act of storage, it was an active engagement. Monks wrote commentaries, debated ideas, and slowly built upon this classical knowledge, ensuring it would be available to fuel the intellectual explosions of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The very universities of the 12th century grew directly from these monastic and cathedral schools. The so-called Dark Ages were, in fact, the essential incubator for the learning that would follow. The visual proof is overwhelming. A map animation of Europe from 500 to 1000 AD would not show a spreading blot of darkness, but a dynamic flickering of new kingdoms, trade routes, and cultural centers. And when we showcase the artifacts, the dazzling pages of the Book of Kells, the elegant precision of a Carolingian gospel book, the rugged beauty of a Sutton-Hoo helmet, or the simple efficiency of a heavy plow, we are not looking at relics from a forgotten wasteland. We are looking at the confident creations of a resilient and innovative people, living in an age not of darkness but of challenging and brilliant dawn. Now we come to a myth so horrifying it has become a dark symbol for the entire pre-modern world. The image of the Middle Ages as an era defined by the relentless burning of witches at the stake. This powerful and terrifying scene seems to capture the very essence of medieval superstition and cruelty. Yet, in a stunning historical irony, this picture is almost entirely wrong. The great European witch hunts, with their mass panics and fiery executions, were not a medieval phenomenon at all. They belong squarely to the early modern period, exploding in the 16th and 17th centuries, a full 100 years or more after the Middle Ages had officially ended. The real story of the medieval attitude toward witchcraft is one of surprising skepticism and legal restraint, a reality that stands in stark contrast to the fires that would later engulf the continent. To understand why, we need to step into the mindset of the early medieval church. For centuries, its official position, as defined by important church rulings like the Canon Episcopi from around the year 900, was remarkably clear. This document declared that belief in witches specifically, the idea that women could fly through the night with the goddess Diana and work magic, was itself an illusion and a pagan superstition. The official line was that anyone who believed in the reality of such witchcraft was committing a sin of disbelief, essentially falling for a demonic deception. This wasn't a license for persecution, it was a doctrinal bulwark against it. The primary focus of the Church's disciplinary machinery for most of the Middle Ages was on heresy doctrinal deviations from official church teaching, not on village-level magic. When people were accused of harmful magic or maleficium, the typical response from ecclesiastical courts was not execution but penance. An individual might be ordered to fast, go on a pilgrimage, or perform some other act of contrition to atone for their superstitious practices. The idea of a vast, diabolical conspiracy of witches worshipping the devil in secret Sabbaths had not yet taken hold in the popular or legal imagination. So, what changed? How did Europe transition from this relative skepticism to the full-blown panic that saw an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people, mostly women, executed for witchcraft between the 1500s and 1700s? The shift was driven by a perfect storm of social, religious, and intellectual factors that collided after the Middle Ages were over. The single most important catalyst was the publication of a book in 1487, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written by a German Dominican friar named Heinrich Kramer, this book was a devastatingly effective work of propaganda and a practical guide for witch hunters. Kramer, who had been frustrated by local authorities dismissing his own attempts to prosecute witches, wrote a text that wove together folklore about harmful magic with a new and terrifying theology. The Malleus presented witchcraft not as a silly superstition, but as a real and terrifying heresy, a deliberate pact with the devil, sealed by sexual intercourse dedicated to undermining Christian society. It was filled with misogynistic vitriol, famously arguing that all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable, and providing detailed instructions on how to identify, prosecute, and extract confessions from suspects. But the Malleus Maleficarum alone did not cause the witch craze. It was the invention of the printing press that allowed its poisonous ideas to spread with unprecedented speed across Europe, just in time for the continent's greatest period of religious upheaval. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation that followed, shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom. This created a world of intense competition and paranoia. Both Protestant and Catholic leaders saw the devil at work everywhere, trying to undermine their respective versions of the true faith. In this atmosphere of extreme spiritual anxiety, the witch became the ultimate scapegoat, a symbol of the devil's subversion from within. The hunt for witches became a way for authorities, both religious and secular, to purify their communities and demonstrate their own doctrinal rigor. The legal systems also changed, adopting Roman law procedures that permitted torture to obtain confessions, which led to the spiraling accusations that characterized the worst of the panics. People would be tortured until they named accomplices, who would then be arrested and tortured in turn, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and death. This is why the timeline is so crucial. The medieval period from the 5th to the late 15th century was largely a time when the legal and theological framework for mass witch hunts did not exist. The early modern period, from the 16th century onward, was when all the necessary ingredients, the new demonology, the technology of the printing press, the paranoia of the Reformations, and the legal use of torture, combined to create the perfect storm. Conflating the two is a major historical error that misplaces the blame for one of Europe's darkest chapters onto an earlier era. The real witch craze belongs to the world of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the birth of the modern state. A stark reminder that persecution and panic are not the sole property of any one age we might label dark, but can flourish in times of great change and uncertainty. But what about the most intimate of human connections? The myth of the universally arranged and loveless medieval marriage is a powerful one, painting a picture of a world where hearts were always secondary to land deals, where personal happiness was sacrificed without a second thought for political advantage. While it's absolutely true that among the high nobility, marriage was a primary tool of statecraft, a way to seal alliances, end wars, and amalgamate vast estates, to assume this political framework automatically precluded any genuine affection is to ignore the complex and often tender reality of medieval relationships. For the elite, a strategic marriage was the beginning of a partnership, not necessarily the end of any possibility for love. We have profoundly moving evidence of this in the personal letters that have survived the centuries. Take the correspondence between Thomas de Clanbau and his wife. In one heartfelt letter, Thomas writes to his own heartily beloved cousin, telling her that there is no earthly thing that I covet so much as to have your presence, and signs off, I am yours till death. This is not the cold, formal language of a mere political arrangement. It's the intimate voice of a man deeply missing his wife. Even the most powerful figures of the age were not immune. Consider the legendary romance of Abelard and Heloise in the 12th century. Their affair was a scandal that ended in tragedy, yet their later letters, written after they had both taken religious vows, reveal a bond that transcended their circumstances, filled with a poignant and enduring intellectual and emotional passion. Heloise's letters to Abelard are particularly stunning, openly declaring her unwavering love for him above even God, a sentiment of shocking intensity for any era. This potential for love within an arranged framework becomes even clearer when we look at the partnership between William Marshall and Isabel de Clare. William was a celebrated knight but of relatively modest birth, while Isabel was a formidable heiress, one of the richest women in England. Their marriage in 1889 was on the surface a classic political match, granting William the lands and title his prowess had earned. Yet, chronicles and records suggest their union grew into one of deep mutual respect and affection. They were constant companions. She frequently traveled with him on his campaigns across England and Normandy, and together they raised 10 children. When William was on his deathbed, it was Isabel and their children he summoned to his side, and he entrusted his body to be buried by the Knights Templar, but his heart, according to some accounts, was to be given to Isabel, a powerful, symbolic gesture of his enduring devotion. These were not isolated exceptions. The entire culture of courtly love, while often an idealized and literary fantasy, nonetheless created a social atmosphere that celebrated romantic feeling, emotional intimacy, and the deep admiration between a knight and his lady. It set a cultural standard that encouraged emotional connection, suggesting that even within a politically necessary marriage, a noble couple could aspire to find not just a partner in governance, but a true companion of the heart. And when we shift our gaze from the castle to the cottage, the entire narrative of forced marriage collapses completely. For the vast majority of the medieval population, the peasants, artisans, and ordinary townsfolk, marriage was overwhelmingly a matter of personal choice. These were not heiresses whose hands were worth counties or knights whose alliances could shift the balance of power. For a farmer, a blacksmith, or a brewer, a good marriage was about finding a capable partner to help run a farm or a workshop, someone who was strong, skilled, and of good character. While parents certainly had a say and would offer advice, hoping their child would make a prudent match that benefited both families, they rarely had the absolute power to compel a union against their child's will. The economic reality for most people meant there simply wasn't enough concentrated wealth or property to justify the kind of draconian control seen among the aristocracy. Young people met at village festivals, church ale celebrations, and while working in the fields. Courtship rituals were a normal part of life. We know from manorial court records that couples were often fined for fornication or having a child out of wedlock, but these very fines reveal something crucial. These were relationships born of personal attraction and choice, not parental decree. The vibrant tradition of medieval folk songs is filled with tales of young love, of milkmaids and ploughmen, of secret trysts and longing hearts, reflecting the romantic hopes and dreams of ordinary people. This respect for individual choice was powerfully reinforced by the medieval church, which placed the concept of mutual consent at the very center of its definition of a valid marriage. This was a revolutionary idea, one that gave even the lowest-born serf a remarkable degree of agency over their own life. Church law, developed by canon lawyers over centuries, was explicitly clear. For a marriage to be sacramentally binding, both the bride and the groom must give their free and voluntary consent. No one, not a father, not a lord, not a king, could force a valid marriage upon an unwilling person. This principle was vigorously defended in the church courts, which had jurisdiction over marital disputes. There are countless recorded cases where individuals successfully petitioned the court to annul a marriage that had been forced upon them, or to have their secret but consensual marriage officially recognized over the objections of their furious parents. The words of the wedding vow itself, which began to be standardized in this period, are telling. The priest would ask, "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" And, "Wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" The required response was, "I will." This direct personal affirmation was the legal and spiritual engine of the entire ceremony. A 12th century theologian, Gratian, whose work became the foundation of canon law, summed it up with stunning clarity. It is not cohabitation or the consent of the parents that makes a marriage, but the consent of the parties. In a world structured by hierarchy and obligation, this was a profound assertion of individual will, a protected space where the heart's choice was granted sacred authority. So why does the myth of the universally arranged and loveless marriage persist with such tenacity? It is once again a case of historical spotlighting. The most dramatic, best documented marriages are those of kings and queens, the strategic unions that changed the map of Europe. These are the stories that fill the history books and inspired television dramas, creating an overwhelming impression that this was the universal experience. We hear about the sorrows of a princess sent to a foreign land to marry a man she's never met, and we extrapolate that sorrow to every village and town. But this is to ignore the quiet, everyday reality of millions of people. The evidence from love letters, from court records, from folk poetry, and from church doctrine all points in the same direction. While the medieval world understood the practical necessities of marriage, it never lost sight of the human heart at its core. It was a society that could produce both the complex legalism of a feudal marriage contract and the tender, aching longing of a troubadour's song, recognizing that land, power, and love could, and often did, coexist in the same lifelong partnership. But to truly understand the medieval world, we must venture beyond the stone arches of the cathedral and into the complex landscape of the human heart, confronting our 18th myth, the belief that medieval people were all deeply and unquestioningly religious. It's a comforting image of universal, uniform piety, of entire villages united in fervent prayer and unwavering doctrinal faith. The reality, however, was far messier, more fascinating, and infinitely more human. While it is undeniably true that Christianity was the framework through which everyone understood the world, the calendar, the law, the rhythm of daily life, this did not automatically translate into blind, orthodox belief for every single individual. The medieval religious experience was a vibrant, often contradictory tapestry woven with threads of profound devotion, casual apathy, stubborn superstition, and even outright skepticism, creating a relationship with the divine that was far more pragmatic and complex than our modern stereotypes allow. If we want to hear the authentic voice of medieval faith, we need to listen not to the soaring Latin hymns of the Mass, but to the frustrated complaints of the parish priests themselves. The sermon literature that has survived is filled with a consistent, almost weary refrain of clerical disappointment. Priests and bishops repeatedly chastised their congregations for a whole host of what they saw as failures. They lamented the widespread ignorance of basic prayers and doctrine, with many parishioners barely able to mumble the Lord's Prayer or the Creed. They complained about irreverent behavior during the most sacred parts of the Mass, people chatting, conducting business deals, flirting, or even gambling in the back of the church. One preacher, John Merck, writing in the 14th century, grumbled about his flock treating the church like a social hall, coming to see and be seen rather than to pray. These weren't accusations of heresy, but of something that might have been even more frustrating for the clergy: simple apathy. The records show that many people attended church because it was the social and legal expectation, a weekly ritual that defined their community, but their minds and hearts were often elsewhere, focused on the more immediate concerns of harvest, family, and survival. Beyond apathy, there existed a vast and resilient underworld of folk belief and practice that operated in parallel to, and sometimes in direct conflict with, official church teaching. This was the world of the cunning folk, the local wise men and women who served as healers, fortune-tellers, and makers of charms. For the average peasant or townsfolk, the church offered salvation for the soul, but a cunning person offered practical solutions for the problems of daily life. If your cow was sick, your butter wouldn't churn, or you suspected a neighbor had cursed you, the local cunning woman with her knowledge of herbs and ancient rhymes was often the first port of call. These practitioners used a mix of practical botany, psychological insight, and rituals that frequently blended Christian elements like the sign of the cross or prayers to saints with much older pre-Christian traditions. They created amulets inscribed with psalms to ward off evil, used hazel rods to find water, and prescribed rituals to win love or protect a newborn. The official church condemned these practices as superstition or even witchcraft, but they proved impossible to eradicate because they addressed a fundamental human need for a sense of control and comfort in an unpredictable and often harsh world. This pragmatic approach to the supernatural is perfectly captured in the concept of incidental paganism. Across Europe, but particularly in rural areas, elements of older beliefs survived for centuries, not as organized rival religions, but as a collection of localized customs and superstitions that people saw no contradiction in holding alongside their Christian faith. In England, wells and springs that had once been sacred to Celtic deities were rededicated to Christian saints, yet people continued to leave offerings and seek their healing powers in exactly the same way their ancestors had. In Scandinavia, belief in land spirits, elves, and trolls persisted long after the official conversion to Christianity, and farmers would still leave a bowl of porridge out for these unseen beings to ensure the fertility of their fields and the health of their livestock. This wasn't a secret rejection of Christianity, it was a form of spiritual insurance. Why risk offending any powerful force, whether saint or spirit, that might influence your daily fortune? The medieval mindset was often one of covering all bases, creating a personalized spirituality that drew from every available source of power and comfort. Perhaps the most telling evidence of this complex and sometimes critical relationship with religious authority comes from the walls of the churches themselves. While we look up at the majestic stained glass windows, medieval parishioners often left their mark in a more humble but more revealing form: graffiti. Scratched into the stone pillars and walls of cathedrals and parish churches across Europe are thousands of informal drawings and inscriptions. Among them are ships, animals, and geometric patterns, but there are also deeply personal and often surprisingly irreverent images. We find caricatures of priests with exaggerated features, sometimes even shown in compromising situations. There are curses aimed at neighbors and humorous, sometimes crude, comments. This was not the work of outside vandals, but of the congregation itself, a spontaneous, unvarnished expression of the people's voice. To carve a silly picture of your priest into the very fabric of God's house suggests a relationship with the clergy that was far from one of cowed, uniform reverence. It points to a familiarity, even a cheeky criticism, that coexisted with a general acceptance of the church's overall authority. These graffiti artists were not atheists. They were participants in a system they also felt comfortable enough to mock in their own small way. The very architecture of belief was also more flexible than we might assume. The medieval church was not a monolithic, all-seeing police force of the soul. It was a sprawling, often inefficient bureaucracy that struggled to impose a uniform orthodoxy across a vast and diverse continent. Heretical movements did arise, like the Cathars in southern France or the Lollards in England, but for every organized heretic, there were thousands of ordinary people whose beliefs were simply a hazy, personalized blend of official doctrine, local folklore, and practical magic. They would attend Mass on Sunday, confess their sins at Easter, and then on Monday consult the cunning woman about a lost ring or recite an old charm over a sick child. This was not seen as hypocrisy by most. It was simply how the world worked. The line between religion and superstition, between piety and pragmatism, was blurry and constantly shifting. The true picture of medieval faith, then, is not one of a monolithic, candlelit piety, but of a vibrant, noisy, and often contradictory marketplace of the spirit. It was a world where a person might genuinely fear hell, yet still laugh at a caricature of their priest scratched into a church pillar, where they might pray to the Virgin Mary for salvation and also leave an offering at a fairy well for a good harvest. This rich, textured reality reveals a humanity instantly recognizable to our own, a search for meaning and control in a mysterious universe, using every tool, both sacred and profane, available at the time. Our journey through these busted myths now brings us to one of the most foundational concepts in all of medieval history, a diagram you've almost certainly seen in a textbook, the feudal pyramid. It's a beautifully simple, almost mathematical structure. At the top, the king, below him a layer of powerful lords, beneath them the knights, and supporting the entire structure at the bottom, a vast, faceless base of serfs. This image of a rigid, top-down hierarchy is incredibly satisfying. It gives us a sense of order and control over a complex past, but that sense of order is an illusion. The reality of medieval power and landholding was not a neat pyramid. It was a tangled, shifting, and often contradictory web of relationships that varied dramatically from one valley to the next and from one century to another. The very term feudal system is a modern invention, a label applied by 17th and 18th century lawyers and historians who looked back at the messy legal documents of the Middle Ages and tried to impose a logical structure upon them. They created a coherent model out of what was in practice a gloriously incoherent reality. To understand why the pyramid is a myth, we need to look at the glue that supposedly held it all together, the exchange of land for military service. In the classic model, a king grants a large estate, known as a fief, to a lord in return for the lord's oath of loyalty and a promise to provide knights for the king's army. That lord then parcels out parts of his land to knights in return for their service, and the knights, in turn, are supported by the labor of serfs bound to the land. It's a clean chain of command, but on the ground, this chain was constantly breaking, being renegotiated, or simply being ignored. A single knight might hold small pieces of land from 3 or 4 different lords, creating conflicting loyalties that would be impossible to untangle if those lords ever went to war with each other. What was a vassal to do? His primary loyalty was supposed to be to his liege lord, but figuring out who that was could be a legal nightmare. This wasn't a rigid hierarchy, it was a latticework of overlapping and competing obligations, more like a complex legal network than a simple pyramid. Perhaps the most significant crack in the foundation of the pyramid model is the concept of allodial land. This was land owned outright, free and clear, with no feudal obligations to any superior lord whatsoever. The textbook pyramid suggests that all land was held from the king, but this was simply not the case. In many parts of Europe, particularly in regions of what is now southern France, Germany, and Scandinavia, allodial land was not the exception, it was the norm. A family could own their farm for generations, answering to no lord but themselves, paying no feudal dues and owing no military service. They were, in effect, independent freeholders. This reality completely shatters the bottom-heavy image of the pyramid, revealing a medieval landscape where a significant portion of the population operated entirely outside the classic feudal structure. These allodial owners might still live in a community with lords and vassals, but their economic and legal standing was fundamentally different from that of a serf or even a tenant farmer. And speaking of serfs, the bottom tier of our mythical pyramid is perhaps the most misleading of all. The image of the serf as a helpless, immobile slave to the land is a powerful one, but it drastically oversimplifies their actual legal and social position. While serfs were indeed bound to the manor and owed labor and goods to their lord, they were not without rights or room to maneuver. Manorial court records, which documented the daily life of the village, show serfs actively using the legal system to defend their traditional privileges. They could and did sue their own lords or their neighbors over disputes about land boundaries, inheritance, and the exact terms of their labor obligations. Furthermore, the idea that serfs were permanently trapped is another fiction. There was a well-known legal principle throughout much of medieval Europe, stadtluft macht frei, or town air makes you free. If a serf could manage to escape their manor and live in a chartered town for a year and a day without being caught, they would legally become a free person. This provided a tangible, if difficult, path to freedom and incentivized lords to treat their serfs with a degree of fairness to prevent them from fleeing. The medieval peasant, even the unfree serf, was often a shrewd negotiator of their own rights within a system of mutual, if unequal, obligation. When we pull back and look at a map of medieval Europe, the idea of a single, uniform system becomes utterly impossible to sustain. The landscape of power was a patchwork quilt of wildly different customs. In England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, a more centralized version of feudal tenure was imposed, making the pyramid model somewhat more applicable there, though still far from perfect. But cross the Channel into the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and you find a dizzying array of hundreds of semi-independent principalities, bishoprics, and free cities, each with its own laws and relationships. Meanwhile, in the thriving city-states of northern Italy, like Venice and Genoa, power was wielded not by landholding knights, but by wealthy merchant oligarchs whose influence came from trade, not feudal grants. In the vast plains of Eastern Europe, a late form of serfdom was actually intensifying just as it was beginning to loosen in the West. To claim that all these disparate societies operated under the same feudal system is to ignore the breathtaking diversity of medieval life. The true picture is one of endless local variation where custom was king and the balance of power was in a constant state of flux, negotiated daily in manor courts, village assemblies, and on the boundaries of those thousands of independent allodial farms. Of course, the rigid structures of society could be navigated by the ambitious and the fortunate, which leads us directly to our 20th myth, the stubborn belief that medieval society was a frozen pond, that you were born into your station and you died in it with no chance of ever changing your fate. This image of a completely static, birth-determined world is another profound exaggeration. While it's absolutely true that medieval Europe was deeply hierarchical, built on a worldview that saw the social order as part of a divine plan, it was not a prison without keys. Movement, both upward and downward, was not only possible but a recognizable feature of the medieval landscape, creating a society that was far more dynamic and fluid than our modern stereotypes allow. To understand this, we need to look beyond the theoretical pyramid and into the vibrant economic engines of the age, the towns and cities. From the 11th century onwards, the growth of urban centers created entirely new arenas for social advancement that operated outside the traditional land-based feudal hierarchy. In a bustling town, your worth was increasingly measured not by your bloodline, but by your skill, your business acumen, and the weight of your coin purse. A master craftsman, through talent and shrewd management, could amass significant wealth, becoming a pillar of his urban community. Think of a goldsmith in Florence or a wool merchant in Ghent. These men controlled vast sums of money, employed dozens of workers, and their influence could rival that of a country knight. They used this newfound wealth to buy large townhouses, educate their children, and secure positions on the town council, wielding real political power. Their success was a testament to a different kind of ladder, one built on commerce and craftsmanship, where a sharp mind and skilled hands could lift a family from obscurity to prominence in a single generation. The battlefield was another dramatic stage for reinvention. The chaos of combat has always been a great leveler, and in the medieval period, exceptional courage and military prowess could catapult a man from the ranks into the knightly class. While the path to knighthood was expensive and often required a certain social standing to begin with, it was not an impossibility for a common soldier who distinguished himself in a moment of crisis. A lord, witnessing astonishing bravery that saved the day, might reward a low-born man at arms with the ultimate honor of a knighthood, granting him the spurs, the title, and often a parcel of land to support his new status. This was the military equivalent of a lottery win, rare, but a powerful cultural story that fueled the hopes of many. It created a powerful incentive for loyalty and valor, reinforcing the ideal that martial skill could, on occasion, trump the accident of birth. But perhaps the single most powerful engine for social mobility in the Middle Ages was the Church. This vast, continent-spanning institution was in many ways the first true meritocracy of the Western world. It operated on a principle that was radical for its time, that a man's intellectual ability and spiritual devotion could matter more than his noble lineage. The Church provided a structured career path that was open to talented boys from even the humblest backgrounds. A bright peasant child, noticed by the local priest, could be sent to a monastic school. If he excelled in his studies, he might proceed to a university, and from there his path could lead anywhere. Through scholarship, administrative skill, and political savvy, a man of low birth could rise to become an abbot, overseeing vast monastic estates, or a bishop, wielding power that was often equal to that of a count or a duke. The ultimate symbol of this potential is the papacy itself. Pope Alexander V, born as Pietro Filaghi around 1339, was a case in point. He was not from a noble house, he was an orphan of likely very modest means. His intellect was his ticket out of poverty. He joined the Franciscan order, studied at the universities of Oxford and Paris, and became a noted theologian and diplomat, eventually being elected to the highest office in Christendom in 1409. His story, while exceptional, was not unique. It stood as a living testament to the Church's power to pluck a man from obscurity and place him at the very pinnacle of earthly influence. For those at the very bottom of the social ladder, the serfs bound to the land, the paths to freedom were narrower, but they did exist. The most famous of these was the principle of Stadtluft macht frei, town air makes you free. This was a legal custom recognized across much of medieval Europe. If a serf could successfully flee their manor and reside within the walls of a chartered town for 1 year and 1 day without being apprehended by their lord, they would be legally recognized as a free person. This was a tremendous risk, but it offered a powerful incentive for lords to treat their labor force with a degree of fairness, lest they lose them entirely. Beyond flight, there was also the possibility of purchase. A thrifty and industrious serf family, perhaps through selling surplus produce at a town market or practicing a craft on the side, could slowly accumulate enough savings to buy their legal freedom from their lord. For the lord, this was a welcome infusion of cash. For the serf, it was the purchase of a new life. Once free, they could lease land on more favorable terms, move to a town to practice a trade, or even seek their fortune as a soldier. These were not easy paths, but they were cracks in the system, avenues of hope that prevented the feudal structure from becoming an inescapable trap. The ultimate embodiment of this potential for meteoric rise is the story of William Marshall, a man whose life reads like a medieval epic designed to shatter all our myths about static social class. William was born around 1147 as a younger son of a minor Anglo-Norman baron. As a fourth son, he stood to inherit virtually nothing: no land, no title, no real future. He was, by the standards of his day, a nobleman, but one perched on the very lowest rung of the aristocracy with few prospects. His fortune changed not through birth, but through his unparalleled skill and character. He was trained as a knight and quickly gained fame as one of the greatest tournament fighters of his generation. A superstar of the joust whose prowess in these mock battles earned him immense riches in ransoms and prizes. But his value went far beyond brute strength. He was a man of impeccable loyalty and political wisdom. He served as a tutor in arms to the young King Henry, son of Henry II, and later became a trusted loyalist of a succession of English monarchs. His steadfastness through civil wars and regencies earned him the trust of the realm. As a reward for his decades of faithful service, and in a move that stunned the older aristocratic families, the critically ill King John appointed William Marshall as Regent of England for his 9-year-old son, Henry III, in 1216. Here was a man who had started with little more than his sword and his honor, who through military excellence, unwavering loyalty, and sheer force of personality, rose to become the most powerful man in the kingdom, governing England itself at a time of profound crisis. William Marshall's life is not just an inspiring story. It is historical proof that the medieval world, for all its emphasis on birth and hierarchy, always left room for the extraordinary individual to carve out a destiny that defied all expectations. The myth of total stagnation ignores the countless small stories of the merchant's son who became mayor, the peasant's son who became a bishop, and the landless knight who became a regent, all of which reveal the dynamic, aspirational, and very human heart that beat within the chest of the Middle Ages. When we picture the ultimate symbol of medieval religious persecution, one institution almost always springs to mind, shrouded in black robes and the smoke of burning flesh, the Inquisition. This image is a cornerstone of our darkest fantasies about the Middle Ages, but it's built on a fundamental error of timing. The most infamous and brutal version, the one that truly fuels our nightmares, was the Spanish Inquisition. And here's the crucial myth-busting detail. It was established in 1478. By almost any historical measure, that year falls at the very tail end of the Middle Ages, a period most scholars agree was giving way to the early modern era. This places the Spanish Inquisition not in the heart of the so-called Dark Ages, but in the same century as Columbus's voyage to the Americas and the dawn of the Renaissance. The institution we most associate with medieval terror was in fact a creature of the emerging modern world. To understand the real story, we need to distinguish between two very different entities, the later Spanish Inquisition and its much earlier predecessor, the Medieval Inquisition, which was founded in the 13th century. The context for this earlier Inquisition was the serious threat posed by major heretical movements, particularly Catharism in southern France. The Cathars, also known as Albigensians, held a dualist belief that the material world was evil and created by a malevolent deity, a direct challenge to the core doctrines of the Catholic Church. Their growing influence prompted the Church to action, leading Pope Gregory IX to formally establish the Papal Inquisition around 1231. But the procedures and goals of this medieval body were often more legalistic and focused on persuasion than the popular imagination allows. Its primary mission was not to burn heretics at the first opportunity, but to get them to recant their errors and be reconciled to the Church. The process was heavily influenced by the rediscovery of Roman law, which emphasized formal inquiry, the collection of evidence, and the careful recording of testimony. An inquisitor would arrive in a town, preach a sermon calling for heretics to come forward, and then open a period for accusations and confessions. Confession and repentance were the desired outcomes. Those who came forward voluntarily and admitted their errors were typically given relatively light penances, such as fasting, pilgrimage, or wearing a cross sewn onto their clothing. The use of torture to extract confessions was technically permitted after the papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, but its application was subject to restrictions. It was not supposed to draw blood or cause permanent injury, and a confession given under torture had to be freely repeated afterward to be considered valid. While there is no denying that the medieval Inquisition could be severe and that executions did occur, particularly for relapsed heretics who fell back into error after once abjuring, the immediate and automatic sentence of burning was far from the norm. Furthermore, its power was never universal. It was most active in specific regions like Languedoc in France and parts of Italy where heresy was considered a major threat. In large swaths of Europe, including much of England and Scandinavia, its presence was minimal or non-existent. It did not operate as a single, omnipotent police force spanning the entire continent. The terrifying, monolithic image we have today is almost entirely a conflation of this earlier, more nuanced medieval Inquisition with the later, and genuinely more brutal Spanish Inquisition. Established by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella with papal approval, The Spanish Inquisition had a different primary focus, rooting out conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity who were suspected of secretly practicing their former faith. It was notably more centralized, more closely tied to the Spanish crown, and more systematic in its use of terror as a tool of state policy. Its auto da fe ceremonies, public spectacles of penance and execution, were grand theatrical events designed to solidify religious and political unity in the newly unified kingdom. This is the institution that perfected the image of the hooded inquisitor and the omnipresent fear of the secret accusation. This later, early modern brutality was then projected backward by artists, writers, and historians onto the entire medieval period, creating a one-size-fits-all vision of inquisitorial horror. To visualize the correction of this myth is to see a clear timeline on screen. It would show the medieval Inquisition confined to specific pockets of 13th and 14th century Europe, followed by a significant gap, and then the sudden emergence and intense concentration of the Spanish Inquisition in the late 15th century, spilling over into the 16th and 17th, a powerful illustration that the worst of the inquisitorial terror happened not depths of the Middle Ages, but as Europe was marching toward the modern world. But if the reality of a knight's armor was one of agile mobility, then the reality of medieval warfare itself shatters another cherished myth, the idea that it was nothing more than a chaotic, mindless brawl, a disorganized scrum of knights charging headlong into each other with brute force being the only deciding factor. This popular image ignores the profound strategy, intricate logistics, and remarkable variety that defined military conflict for centuries. While the thunderous charge of heavily armored knights was certainly a dramatic and potent tactic, it was just one instrument in a much larger and more complex orchestra of war, conducted by commanders who needed to be as shrewd and calculating as any modern general. Consider for a moment the sheer intellectual challenge of a battle like Agincourt, fought in 1415. The popular story focuses on the mud, the longbows, and the heroic English underdog. But behind that victory was a masterclass in tactical discipline and environmental exploitation. The English king, Henry V, was massively outnumbered by a French force boasting some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. A mindless commander would have met that charge with a mindless countercharge. Instead, Henry did something brilliantly deliberate. He chose his ground with care, positioning his army on a recently plowed field flanked by two dense woods. This funneled the approaching French knights into a narrow killing zone. He then had his men hammer sharpened wooden stakes into the ground at an angle, creating a deadly, impromptu palisade in front of his longbowmen. When the French cavalry charged, they did not meet a disorganized rabble. They were funneled into a bottleneck, their horses were impaled on the stakes, and they were met with a storm of arrows so intense that chroniclers described it as seeming to snow. The French men at arms, forced to dismount and slog through deep mud in heavy armor, were then systematically cut down by the more lightly equipped English soldiers. This was not mindless chaos. This was a meticulously planned and executed tactical trap, a victory of brains and discipline over numbers and brute force. The same story unfolds at the Battle of Crecy 70 years earlier. Here, the English king, Edward III, used a combination of defensive positioning and the revolutionary power of the longbow to defeat a similarly larger French army. He arrayed his forces on a slope, forcing the enemy to attack uphill. He interspersed his dismounted men at arms with bodies of longbowmen, creating a layered defense. The French launched a series of cavalry charges, but each was broken up by volleys of arrows that could pierce armor at a distance. The Genoese crossbowmen hired by the French found their slower-firing weapons outmatched by the rapid, plunging fire of the English longbows, especially when a sudden rain wet the strings of their crossbows, rendering many useless. The battle was a disaster for the French chivalry, not because they lacked courage, but because they relied on a single, predictable tactic against an enemy that had thoughtfully integrated multiple arms, archers, dismounted knights, and defensive terrain into a cohesive and devastating whole. Animated battle maps reveal this beautifully, showing not a single swirling melee, but distinct phases: the advance of crossbowmen, their rout under arrow fire, the disjointed French cavalry charges breaking against the English lines, and the systematic collapse of the entire French formation. This was chess, not a bar fight, and the strategic mind of a medieval commander was not only tested on the open field. For every set-piece battle, there were dozens of sieges, which were often far more complex, time-consuming, and scientifically demanding endeavors. The image of an army simply surrounding a castle and waiting for starvation is a gross oversimplification. Siege warfare was a sophisticated science, a duel of engineers and logisticians. Attackers would construct massive wooden siege towers called belfries to get their soldiers over the walls. They would use battering rams protected by mobile sheds called sows or cats to pound at the gates. But the most intellectually fascinating aspects were often hidden underground and in the air. Sapping and mining involved digging tunnels beneath the castle walls to collapse them. Defenders would dig counter-mines to intercept the attackers underground, leading to claustrophobic, brutal tunnel fights in the dark. Above ground, the trebuchet, the ultimate siege engine of its age, was a masterpiece of physics. These were not simple catapults, they were complex counterweight-powered machines that could hurl massive stones with terrifying accuracy over hundreds of yards. Building one required skilled carpenters and engineers, and their operation was a precise science of calculating weights and trajectories to systematically dismantle a castle's battlements. The entire process was a slow, methodical dismantling of a fortress's defenses, requiring immense patience, resources, and technical knowledge. None of this, of course, could happen without a foundation that is often completely invisible in the dramatic paintings of battles, logistics. The idea of a medieval army as a wandering horde living off the land is another myth that crumbles under scrutiny. A major campaign required an elaborate and meticulously planned supply train. Thousands of men and horses consume a staggering amount of food and water every single day. Commanders had to arrange for wagons of grain, herds of cattle on the hoof, and shipments of wine and ale. They needed to secure supplies of arrows by the hundreds of thousands, nails for horseshoes, timber for siege engines, and spare parts for armor and weapons. The movement of an army was a massive administrative undertaking, requiring clerks, quartermasters, and foraging parties operating on a strict schedule. A failure in logistics didn't just mean discomfort. It meant the disintegration of an army through starvation and desertion, often without a single blow being struck. The success of a campaign, therefore, depended as much on the general's ability to manage his supply lines and pay his troops as it did on his courage in battle. The mindless brute of popular imagination would have never been able to coordinate the movement of hundreds of supply wagons, the construction of a pontoon bridge, or the multi-week bombardment of a fortress. The true medieval general was a master of planning, engineering, and administration, whose greatest victories were often won not in the heat of the melee, but in the quiet of the command tent, surrounded by maps and logistical reports. And so we arrive at a myth that paints the medieval world in the smallest of brushstrokes, the stubborn belief that people were almost permanently rooted to their village, living and dying within sight of the same church spire, utterly ignorant of the wider world. This image of a planet populated by isolated hamlets, each lost in its own microcosm, is a profound misreading of the past. The reality is that the Middle Ages were a period of astonishing mobility, a time when a vast and intricate web of routes connected continents, carrying not just goods but ideas, faith, and people across distances that would have been impressive even a few centuries later. While it is true that the life of a subsistence peasant was largely local, The worlds of the pilgrim, the merchant, the scholar, and the soldier were startlingly global, creating a medieval form of globalization that laid the groundwork for the age of exploration to come. Consider the most powerful engine for mass travel, religious pilgrimage. This was not a casual holiday, it was a sacred obligation, a penitential act, and for many, the grand adventure of a lifetime. Ordinary people from all walks of life undertook journeys of staggering length and difficulty, driven by a faith that made the hardship worthwhile. The roads to major shrines were bustling medieval highways. In England, the route to Canterbury Cathedral, the site of Thomas Becket's martyrdom, was thronged with travelers, their stories so vividly captured by Chaucer that they have become immortal. But Canterbury was a local trip compared to the great continental pilgrimages. Every year, thousands set out for Rome, the heart of Western Christendom, or for the remote northwestern tip of Spain, to the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela. The Camino de Santiago, as this path is known, was a network of routes converging from across Europe, its popularity so immense that it required the construction of hostels, hospitals, and bridges along its entire length, a massive infrastructure project dedicated entirely to the needs of the traveling faithful. And then there was the ultimate journey, the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. To travel from the heart of Europe to the Holy Land was a multi-year, perilous undertaking that involved crossing treacherous mountains, navigating politically volatile territories, and braving the perils of sea voyages. Yet, countless people did it. Guidebooks for pilgrims survived, detailing the routes, the sights to see, and even warning of untrustworthy ship captains and local customs, proving that this was a recognized, if arduous, form of mass tourism. These pilgrims returned home not just with blessings, but with expanded horizons. They had seen different cultures, heard other languages, and brought back stories that stretched the mental map of their entire village. If pilgrimage moved the soul, trade moved the world. While peasants were tied to the cycle of the seasons, merchants were citizens of a vast, interconnected commercial commonwealth that stretched from the rainy ports of England to the dazzling markets of China. The most famous of these networks was, of course, the Silk Road, but this was not a single road. It was a sprawling labyrinth of overland and maritime routes, a global supply chain operated by a relay of different merchants. A luxury good might begin its journey in a Chinese silk workshop, be carried by Aigha traders across the Taklamakan Desert, sold to Persian merchants in Samarkand, transported by Armenian carters to Black Sea ports, and finally shipped by Genoese or Venetian sailors to the markets of Venice, from where it would be distributed across Europe. This was not a trickle of goods, it was a constant flow. Along with silk came spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves that were worth their weight in gold, as well as gems, ivory, and other exotic wares. But this network moved more than just luxuries. It moved people and ideas. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo is the most legendary example, but his famous travels to the court of Kublai Khan in the 13th century were only possible because of the existing, robust infrastructure of Mongol protected trade routes that made such long-distance travel feasible. He was far from alone. Jewish merchant communities established networks from Spain to India, their family members often living in different ports to facilitate trade. The Hanseatic League, a powerful alliance of trading cities in northern Europe, created its own economic empire, with outposts from London in the west to Novgorod in the east, its ships carrying furs, timber, fish, and wool across the Baltic and North Seas. A merchant in Bruges could have a reasonably accurate understanding of commodity prices in Alexandria or Baghdad, because information traveled along these same routes carried by letters and the merchants themselves. This circulation of people was not limited to those seeking salvation or profit. The life of the mind was also a peripatetic one. The rise of the university in the 12th century created a new class of traveler, the international scholar. A bright young man from a small English village would not simply go to the nearest school. He would journey for weeks to reach a center of learning like the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, or the University of Oxford. These were cosmopolitan hubs where Latin served as a common language, allowing a student from Poland to debate logic with a teacher from Spain and a classmate from Scotland. This academic migration was so formalized that students and masters were often granted special legal protections as they traveled, recognizing their vulnerable status as foreigners. They carried books and ideas with them, creating a pan-European intellectual culture where a theological development in Paris would be debated in Oxford within a matter of months. This constant movement of the educated elite ensured that knowledge, like trade goods, was a fluid and circulating resource, not one locked away in isolated monasteries. To visualize this hidden world of medieval connectivity is to see a map of Europe, North Africa, and Asia come alive with a pulsating network of lines. You would see the great pilgrimage routes, the Camino de Santiago snaking across France and Spain, the Via Francigena leading down to Rome, and the multiple paths converging on Jerusalem from across the continent. Overlaying this, you would see the dense web of Hanseatic shipping lanes in the north, the Venetian and Genoese trade routes crisscrossing the Mediterranean, and stretching like a slender thread across the vastness of Central Asia, the legendary Silk Road connecting the markets of Constantinople to those of Beijing. And dotting this map, you would see the bright points of light representing the university towns Paris, Oxford, Bologna, Salerno, Prague, each a beacon drawing scholars from hundreds of miles away. This was the true medieval world, not a collection of isolated dots, but a brilliantly interconnected web. The peasant in their field may have known only their own horizon, but their lord might have tasted spices from Indonesia. Their priest might have studied theology in a foreign land, and the merchant passing through their market square could have told them first-hand stories of the court of the Great Khan, proving that the medieval mind was far more expansive and the medieval world far smaller than we have ever been led to believe. Yet another profound misconception about the Middle Ages paints the Black Death as a great, indiscriminate leveler, a blind force of nature that struck down rich and poor, young and old with a terrifying and random equality. While the sheer scale of the pandemic in the mid-14th century was indeed apocalyptic, wiping out perhaps half of Europe's population, the idea that it killed without pattern is a dramatic oversimplification. The reality is that the plague's scythe cut along the deeply etched lines of social and economic inequality, exposing a brutal truth about medieval society. Your wealth and status were often the most powerful determinants of whether you lived or died. The mechanics of the disease itself, transmitted by the fleas on black rats, meant that its spread was heavily influenced by human living conditions. The poor, who constituted the vast majority of the population, were tragically vulnerable. They lived in crowded, cramped quarters with poor ventilation, their homes often shared with livestock and their floors made of packed earth. Sanitation was primitive, with waste often dumped into open streets or nearby rivers, creating a perfect breeding ground for the rats that carried the plague-bearing fleas. In these densely packed urban neighborhoods and impoverished rural villages, the disease could race through a community with terrifying speed, wiping out entire families in a matter of days. A single infected rat could introduce the plague into a tenement, and from there it would leapfrog through the thin walls and shared spaces, leaving almost no one untouched. The wealthy elite, however, possessed a powerful and simple defense, the ability to flee. When news of the pestilence reached a city, those with the means, the nobles, wealthy merchants, and high church officials promptly abandoned their urban residences for isolated country estates. This practice, a form of social distancing long before the term quarantine was formally coined, was remarkably effective. By removing themselves from the crowded, rat-infested epicenters of the disease, they drastically reduced their exposure. Their stone manor houses in the countryside were less crowded, better provisioned, and offered a degree of isolation that a city dweller could only dream of. This stark disparity in mortality is chillingly evident in the records. In the Italian city of Florence, for instance, chroniclers noted that the plague seemed to target the poor almost exclusively in some districts, while the fortified palaces of the rich, standing silent and empty, were often spared the worst of the death. This was not a random lottery. It was a demographic catastrophe whose impact was meticulously shaped by poverty and privilege. Furthermore, the plague's devastation was strikingly uneven from region to region, even from one street to the next. Data maps reconstructed by modern historians show a patchwork of mortality, not a uniform blanket of death. Some towns in Central Europe were almost completely wiped out, their populations collapsing by 70 or 80%. Others, often in more remote or less commercially connected areas, experienced significantly lower death rates, sometimes as low as 20%. The difference often came down to trade routes. The Black Death followed the roads and sea lanes of medieval commerce. A major port city like Bristol in England or Marseille in France, teeming with ships and cargo from across the known world, was a perfect entry point for the disease and suffered catastrophically. An inland, agrarian village tucked away in the mountains might have its first case months later, and sometimes the disease would burn itself out in one community while raging unchecked in its neighbor, a seemingly capricious pattern that only underscored how human movement, not blind fate, guided its path. The aftermath of this colossal tragedy, however, is where the story takes a surprising and transformative turn, forcing us to completely rethink the long-term consequences of the pandemic. The myth of universal death obscures one of the most significant social upheavals in European history: the dramatic improvement in the lives of the survivors, particularly the lower classes. With as much as half the labor force wiped out, a fundamental economic shift occurred almost overnight. The value of human labor skyrocketed. For the first time in centuries, peasants and skilled artisans found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. Land was suddenly abundant, but the hands to work it were scarce. Lords who wanted their fields plowed and their harvests brought in now had to compete for workers. This led to a phenomenon that would have been unthinkable before the plague. Peasants could now demand and receive significantly higher wages for their work. This newfound economic leverage did not go unchallenged. The ruling class, desperate to maintain their wealth, and the old feudal order fought back fiercely. Governments across Europe passed sweeping legislation, like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels and force peasants to accept work at the old rates. But the economic forces unleashed by the massive depopulation were too powerful to be contained by mere laws. Enforcement was patchy, and workers simply moved to estates or towns where lords and guildmasters were willing to pay more. This widespread defiance and the friction it caused were major catalysts for popular revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, where commoners marched on London demanding an end to serfdom and greater economic freedom. While these revolts were brutally suppressed, the underlying economic pressure they represented was irreversible. The feudal system, built on a foundation of cheap and readily available labor, had received a mortal blow from which it would never fully recover. This post-plague world, for all its initial trauma, became a kind of golden age for the common laborer. Real wages for agricultural and urban workers rose dramatically and remained high for over a century. Diets improved as more people could afford meat and higher quality bread. Social mobility increased as the rigid boundaries of the old order began to soften under the pressure of economic necessity. A skilled mason or carpenter could now earn enough to own his own tools, educate his children, and even purchase his own piece of land. The psychological impact was just as profound. Having witnessed the fragility of the established hierarchy and having experienced their own economic value, the survivors and their descendants developed a new sense of agency and self-worth. The world had been shattered, but in its place, for a significant portion of the population, arose a society with more opportunity, better living standards, and a greater recognition of the value of the individual worker. The Black Death was undeniably one of the worst catastrophes in human history, but to remember it only for its indiscriminate horror is to miss the profound and paradoxical truth that from the ashes of such unparalleled death arose the first embers of a better life for the living. And so we arrive at our final grand misconception, perhaps the most visually pervasive of them all. The myth that medieval art was primitive and unskilled, a clumsy prelude to the glorious realism of the Renaissance. We look at those stylized figures in illuminated manuscripts with their elongated bodies and gold leaf backgrounds, and we mistakenly see an artist who simply didn't know how to draw properly. But this is a profound misreading, a case of judging an entire artistic philosophy by the standards of a different era. The truth is that medieval artists were not failing to be realistic, they were succeeding brilliantly at an entirely different goal. Their purpose was not to replicate the fleeting, imperfect appearance of the physical world, but to create a window into a higher, eternal, and divine reality. The shift to Renaissance realism was not a sudden acquisition of skill after centuries of ignorance. It was a fundamental change in ideology, a decision to turn that window away from heaven and back onto the earth. To understand this, we must step into the medieval worldview where the material realm was seen as a shadow, a temporary and often deceptive copy of a perfect spiritual realm. The ultimate truth was not what the eye could see, but what the soul could perceive. Therefore, an artist's highest calling was not to be a human camera, but to be a theologian with a brush, a translator of sacred stories and divine principles into visual form. This is why figures in a medieval painting are often not in correct proportion or perspective. Their size was determined by their spiritual importance, not their physical location. A saint or an angel might be depicted as much larger than the surrounding people or buildings, visually communicating their greater significance in the cosmic order. Gold leaf was lavished on backgrounds not simply for decoration, but to represent the uncreated light of heaven itself, a realm beyond time and space. The flattened, non-realistic space forced the viewer to focus on the symbolic meaning of the scene, on the eternal truth behind the narrative, rather than being distracted by the illusion of a believable landscape. Within this deliberate philosophical framework, the level of artistry and technical skill is nothing short of breathtaking. Consider the mind-bending intricacy of the metalwork. A reliquary designed to hold the bone of a saint was not just a box, it was a miniature architectural triumph crafted in gold, silver, and gemstones. Artisans employed techniques like repoussé, where they would hammer the metal from the reverse side to create raised figures, and delicate filigree, weaving fine threads of precious metal into lace-like patterns. These objects shimmer with a spiritual and physical light, their craftsmanship so precise and detailed that it still astonishes modern jewelers. Then there are the illuminated manuscripts, perhaps the most accessible and stunning examples of this sophisticated vision. Take the Lindisfarne Gospels, created in a monastery on a remote English island around the year 700. To call it a book feels almost insulting. It is a portal to another world. Each page is a symphony of complex geometric patterns, intertwined with stylized animals and vibrant, almost psychedelic colors. The precision of the line work, achieved with a quill pen and handmade pigments on vellum, is microscopic in its perfection. The artists understood color theory and optical mixing, placing tiny dots of contrasting colors next to each other to create a vibrancy that still pulses over 1,000 years later. This was not the work of primitive bunglers, it was the work of consummate masters who had dedicated their lives to a sacred craft, achieving a level of detail that required magnifying lenses we have no physical evidence of, suggesting they might have used naturally occurring crystals to see their work with such superhuman clarity. The same expressive power animates the stone of the great churches. Romanesque sculpture, like the terrifying and magnificent Last Judgment tympanum at the Abbey of Saint-Pierre in Moissac, France, is not meant to be a gentle, realistic scene. It is a piece of theological rhetoric carved in stone. The figures are elongated and distorted, their faces contorted with holy awe or demonic torment, their bodies woven into the architectural frame to convey a sense of divine order and overwhelming power. The artist's skill here is in expressionism, using form to evoke a visceral emotional response, fear, piety, and wonder in an often illiterate congregation. This is storytelling of the highest order, using every tool of composition and gesture to communicate complex ideas about salvation and damnation. And all of this artistic vision culminates in the most audacious feat of all, the Gothic cathedral. These were not just churches, they were the embodiment of the medieval universe in stone and glass, and their construction was the equivalent of a modern space program. The goal was to create a space that lifted the soul heavenward, and to do it, medieval engineers performed miracles. They developed the flying buttress, an external skeletal structure that allowed them to build walls so thin they could be replaced almost entirely with stained glass. Walking into Chartres Cathedral is not like walking into a building, it is like stepping inside a jewel. The stained glass windows with their deep blues and radiant reds are not mere decorations. They are the primary walls, and they tell the entire story of Christianity in cascades of light. The skill required to design, color, cut, and lead together these massive panels of glass to make them structurally sound and narratively coherent represents an engineering and artistic pinnacle that has rarely been matched. The entire cathedral is a mathematical and spiritual symphony, its soaring vaults, its harmonious proportions, and its luminous walls all working in concert to create an experience of the sublime. This was not primitive, this was one of the most sophisticated and ambitious artistic projects in human history. The Renaissance did not invent skill. It simply redirected a centuries-old tradition of immense technical mastery toward a new, human-centered ideal, proving that the real medieval world was not a place of crude beginnings, but a civilization capable of creating beauty that still, to this day, has the power to take our breath away. And there you have it, 25 medieval myths completely busted. We have journeyed together from the battlefield to the dinner table, from the soaring cathedral to the peasant's cottage, and in the process, we have discovered a Middle Ages that was dynamic, intellectually curious, and teeming with a humanity that feels far more recognizable than the clichés would have us believe. It was not a stagnant, gray waiting room for the Renaissance, but a vibrant, complicated, and often contradictory era of profound transformation. A time when knights were agile athletes, peasants were savvy legal experts, and the church was the primary patron of scientific inquiry. A world connected by pilgrimage and trade routes where people valued cleanliness, enjoyed spicy and colorful food, and often lived long, full lives. This was a society capable of both the brutal pragmatism of the battlefield and the sublime, heaven-reaching architecture of the Gothic cathedral. The real tragedy of these persistent myths is that they rob the past of its fascinating texture and its profound relevance. By painting the Middle Ages as a simple cartoon of ignorance and filth, we distance ourselves from the people who lived then, missing the chance to see our own struggles, our own ingenuity, and our own capacity for both cruelty and greatness reflected in their stories. When we correct the record, we do more than just set the facts straight. We restore the rich, complex tapestry of a 1,000-year period that laid the very foundations of the modern world. The next time you see a film, read a book, or even play a game set in this period, you will be armed with a new perspective. You will look at a knight in armor and see a master of mobility, not a cumbersome tin can. You will picture a castle hall alive with colorful tapestries and warm light, not a dark and dank dungeon. You will remember the peasant not as a mindless drudge, but as a repository of immense practical knowledge. This journey of rediscovery doesn't have to end here. Which of these busted myths surprised you the most? Was it the revelation that everyone knew the Earth was round, or the shocking agility of a fully armored knight? Perhaps it was the sophisticated spicing of medieval cuisine, or the fact that the great witch hunts were largely an early modern phenomenon. Let me know your thoughts and your biggest aha moments in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives and diving deeper into these discussions with you. If you enjoyed this grand tour through historical truth and want to join me as we continue to question the stories we think we know, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more myth-busting content. Thank you so much for watching and for your incredible curiosity. Until next time, keep questioning.